Chapter 952. What a small world. Danitz jumped in fright as he blurted out, "Sorry, I didn't see anything." Before he could finish his sentence, he had already pulled the door handle towards him. Bang! The door closed, emitting a sound that echoed through the corridor. At this point, Danitz finally came to a realization. What was I doing just now? What is Anderson doing? He instinctively removed the black boxing glove and thought bitterly with a frown. Finally, he decided to return to his room, pack his luggage, and leave. As for what Anderson was trying to do, he felt that something was amiss despite his curiosity. He had no plans on getting himself involved in it, lest he fell into a trap. Captain said that I should maintain fear and respect towards the unknown. So, I should distance myself from this. Just as Danitz turned around, he suddenly heard the door unlock before being opened. Anderson, whose buttons on the lower part of his shirt weren't buttoned up, walked out with a dull, pitch-black knife. He looked at Danitz with a mixed expression. "Aren't you going to try to stop me?" Danitz acutely noticed the chance to mock him as he sniggered. "That's your freedom. If you didn't leave a will, I'll be rich." Anderson rubbed his cheeks. "Aren't you curious about what I encountered?" Danitz glanced at him suspiciously. "I keep feeling as though you're up to something." Anderson roared with laughter. "Well, I had been captured some time ago and was soaked in strange blood with all kinds of ingredients. I was corroded by it for an extended period of time until a strange chrysalis was formed inside my body. This was to create the effect of having a certain level of attraction towards high-sequence beyonders of the hunter pathway." As he spoke, he pointed at his abdomen. Danitz was taken aback. "I've never really heard of something like that. If you were another sex, I might have imagined that you're pregnant." He paused for a moment before asking, "That strange fellow in Revival Square was attracted by the baby, no, chrysalis, in your stomach?" Anderson nodded as Danitz gestured with his hands. "You were trying to cut open your abdomen to extract the chrysalis?" Anderson replied honestly, "Yes, I'm worried about how it would affect me, or if it will continue attracting demigods. I have to make every second count to remove this latent problem." Danitz thought before asking in puzzlement, "Then why aren't you making the attempt? You forgot to set up a will, and you want me to be your witness?" Anderson's facial muscles twitched as he chuckled. "Not bad. Your provoker potion should almost be digested." He then sighed. "After some careful analysis, I believe there's no direct way to extract it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have soaked me in blood and allow the ingredients to seep into me. They could have just opened up my stomach and placed the chrysalis inside before sewing me up." Without waiting for Danitz's reply, he said in thought, "Don't you have the method to contact Gehrman Sparrow? He's been through so much and knows so much, so I would like to consult him on how to resolve this problem." In recent months, Danitz was extremely afraid of people raising the matter about him knowing Gehrman Sparrow, so he subconsciously retorted, "No. I haven't seen him since I left the Golden Dream." Anderson curled the corner of his lips and said, "When you were writing to Gehrman Sparrow, I was beside him and have met his messenger." Danitz's expression immediately froze. He forced a smile after a few seconds. "Then why don't you directly summon his messenger?" Anderson raised his hand again and touched his throat, chuckling. "I don't know the ritual for summoning his messenger." Danitz still suspected that Anderson was up to something, and was unwilling to confirm that he had been repeatedly communicating with Gehrman Sparrow. He then suggested, "Actually, you can always seek the help of our captain on such matters. She's very knowledgeable and good at research. She knows many secret techniques and can also seek the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom for help. She should be able to give you the solution for resolving the matter of the chrysalis in your stomach." If you're embarrassed, I can talk to her for you." Just as he said that, he saw Anderson's face beam. He quickly replied with a rushed tone, "All right, let's do that. I've already packed my luggage. When shall we set off?" Danitz fell into a daze for a few seconds, feeling that he had been tricked by Anderson. He returned to the room, drank his remaining beer, and threw all the miscellaneous items into his luggage bag, leaving behind a dried leaf with golden patterns. This was the token Danitz previously used to establish contact with the Northern States' dominant leader, General May Sanchez. Following Gehrman Sparrow's instructions, he left the leaf inside and allowed the person in charge to follow up. In the room that Danitz checked out of, a candle was suddenly lit as a 2-meter-tall scarlet flame burgeoned. Amidst the flames, a figure walked out. He was wearing a silk top hat, black formal suit, and had white sideburns. He looked outstanding with his deep, blue eyes and mature demeanor. He was none other than Klein as Dwayne Dantes. After picking up the leaf with golden patterns, Klein left the hotel, circling around the sealed-off Revival Square, and came to Kukawa's core region, White Feather Square. May Sanchez's residence was there, located beside a death cathedral that descended downwards. As a standard Loanese gentleman, Dantes looked out of place when walking through the city. Here, the foreigners were a minority, with most foreigners seen around the few major embassies located around Rejoice Square. The other places were filled with mostly locals from Balam. Their skin was slightly brown, and they had curly black hair. Their facial features were soft, and in the eyes of most people from the northern continent, people of the same sex all looked the same, aside from the differences in height and weight. These locals, be it male or female, enjoyed rolling dried tobacco leaves into Balam cigarettes. Along the way, Klein would see residents spewing out smoke alongside the road from time to time. In addition, many of them hung a fruit known as dalawa by their waists. This fruit was the size of 2 fists, with thick skin. After digging open a tiny hole and eating the flesh inside, one could use it to store water, alcohol, and other beverages. Based on Klein's observations, they mostly drank an orange-yellow guater. It was sour with a hint of sweetness, good at quenching thirst and relieving heat. It was also great at keeping people awake. I didn't have a chance to try it before. Klein mumbled as he found the guard manning the general's residence and sought to meet a man named Haggis. Due to his appearance as a Loanese person and a gentleman, the guard didn't deny his request or make it difficult for him. He got a person to head in to get a man in his 30s. The man's facial features and skin were that of a standard Balam native. However, his curly black hair had been pulled straight and neatly combed back as though he was trying to mimic members of high society in the various countries of the northern continent. He wore a white shirt and a black vest, matched with a very formal bow tie. Upon seeing Dwayne Dantes, he said in standard Loanese, "Good afternoon, I'm Haggis. Nice to meet you." His accent was a little odd, different from any borough in Lone. Klein had lived in high society for quite a period of time, so he wasn't too surprised. He said with a smile, "Good afternoon, I'm Dwayne Dantes. I never expected to meet a gentleman who's so good at using the accent of Loanese nobles." Haggis couldn't help but smile. Many children of noble birth from Lone have come to East and West Balam to seek out opportunities. I was fortunate to learn from them. Oh, I might know some of them. Klein wasn't in a rush to talk business as he began making small talk with Haggis like a gentleman. Haggis smiled. "My friend includes Colonel Alfred Hall, the second son of an earl." "Hall." Klein let out a soft chuckle. "I once met Earl Hall at a charity party. He's a true noble. What a small world." Haggis nodded in agreement. "Perhaps this is an arrangement of fate. Unfortunately, Alfred was transferred to East Balam last year." He didn't continue as he immediately invited Dwayne Dantes into the general's residence. When passing through the side door, Klein suddenly looked up, glancing at the embedded stained glass above. The glass shimmered like a rainbow under the illumination of sunlight, as though gazes were sweeping past. Chapter 953 Prophecy. Klein retracted his gaze in a natural manner, held his golden-laid cane, and followed closely behind Haggis before entering the general's residence. The architecture style was completely unlike those found in the southern continent. It didn't make any use of light manipulation to make the rooms appear dark and gloomy, nor did they boldly use some human bones as accessories to produce a strong visual impact. Instead, it was more in the style of the northern continent. Furthermore, there was an undeniable hint of Intis influence. Every column was covered in segmented gold foil. The use of colors in the murals were warm, and there were sculptures embedded with gold. A beautiful spiral staircase descended from above, connecting all 4 stories before ending in the middle of the huge hall where it faced the entrance. It was extremely grand. I have to say that countries led by the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun are really at the forefront when it comes to gold artwork. It doesn't have the feeling of the gaudy nouveau riche. Klein swept his gaze to the palm-sized golden angels that extended out from the staircase's railings and mid-sections of the columns, holding back his urge to caress them. Looking at the guard standing by the 2 sides, he casually found a topic and said to Haggis, "Colonel Alfred Hall seems to have made some significant contributions in West Balam." Haggis nodded and used a Loanese noble accent to say, "He's a determined and brave man. He once led a special forces team of more than 30 men to raid an Intis battalion with more than 1,000 people, completely crippling them. I heard that he had also made significant contributions in East Balam, therefore, becoming a colonel before the age of 30. Sounds impressive. Perhaps Miss Justice's brother has already become a Beyonder with quite a significantly high sequence. In every aristocratic family, every generation should have some members taking the Beyonder path. If this Mr. Alfred finally reaches his goal of becoming a Beyonder with a relatively high sequence and gaining the rank of Brigadier General or Major General through hardship, I wonder how sad would he be when he returns to Bakland to realize that he's no match for his sister's dog. Having drank his medicine before heading out today, Klein used the act of lampooning to adjust his mental state. He didn't ask further about Alfred as he asked with a curious tone, "I realize that there are some differences in the traditions of East and West Balam. Here, in many houses, there are people with human bone decorations, but it's not present in East Balam. I've been here several times, but I've never been able to bring myself to get the answer to this question." Haggis stopped and pointed to the exaggerated spiral staircase. "Mr. Dantes, the general will be here in a few minutes." After informing him of this, he chuckled. It's actually not common to see human bone traditions. Only fiefs that came under the royal family of the Balam Empire still have this tradition. To us, the death of family members doesn't mean that our relationship has come to an end. After the burial, we will take a piece of their bones and place it at home as a decoration as a way to indicate that the deceased continue being with the living. As for which bone to choose, it will be decided by the interring priest through a ritual. The best and most symbolic part is the skull. Some families will even make the skull into a vessel for drinking alcohol, using it only when entertaining the most honored guests. Mr. Dantes, if you close a deal this time, I wish to invite you home. I wish to offer finest wine in my grandfather's skull to show my respects to you. 211 Klein's expression nearly fell apart. He felt that he was incapable of accepting the local customs in this aspect. He laughed and was just about to be perfunctory when he saw a figure slowly walking down the golden railings of the staircase. The person didn't wear a hat. He was wearing a cut black military attire with shimmering gold buttons. The sash he wore was red like blood. He had light brown skin and a rather soft facial outline. His facial features looked scrunched up in the middle of his head, making his face appear abnormally big. Klein, who had obtained the relevant information from various channels, instantly recognized the man to be the dominant ruler of West Balam's northern state. He was May Sanchez, who declared himself as general. On the surface, he wavered between the factions of Lone, Intis, Fainapotter, Faysac, and the resistance, maintaining a balance, but secretly, he had received the support of the numinous episcopate's royal family faction. Meanwhile, Klein suspected that this native general had established a solid working relationship with the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. As for May Sanchez's strength, be it Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina or Admiral of Stars Catlia, he was noted to be a Sequence 5. But the two ladies didn't mention which pathway he was from, as the powers this local general exhibited were mostly related to spirits, but he carried a mystical item from the death pathway. "Good afternoon, Your Excellency." Klein took off his hat, pressed his hand to his chest, and bowed. At this moment, he sensed gazes locking onto him from some unknown location. They were like lights that flashed across the golden angel figures, the sunlight reflected from the stained glass or the lustrous glow from the smooth marble. "Hello there, Mr. Dantes," May Sanchez replied in Dudanese. Having grasped Dudanese through his marionette, Klein naturally was able to understand him. However, in the southern continent, the longer he stayed in East and West Balam, the more he felt the similarities between Dudanese and ancient Fasak. Although these two languages obviously followed different systems, making it much more difficult if he were to truly study Dudanese, certain details were shockingly similar, as it was as though they shared a common heritage. Klein could only be certain that the heritage wasn't Jotun. Pretending as though he hadn't noticed anything, he very naturally chatted with May Sanchez until the other party raised the topic of the arms deal. "How many goods do you have in total?" Klein laughed and replied, "It wouldn't be a problem equipping 3,000 to 4,000 people. In addition, there will be a few cannons." May Sanchez fell silent and said, "Name your price." Klein pretended to deliberate and said, "If you wish for me to send the goods to the northern state, the price would be 50,000 pounds. If you send your troops to retrieve the goods with me and be responsible for the subsequent transportation and safety, it will only cost 40,000 pounds. May Sanchez thought and said, "The latter. Take the down payment and go with my men. Once they see the goods and move it onto our carriages, my men will pay the rest." He paused for a moment and then added, "However, I do not have much loan gold pounds. So you don't have enough foreign reserves?" Klein surveyed the area and said with an unconcerned smile, "You can directly pay me in gold coins, or even gold bars or gold bricks." May Sanchez was rather decisive. He didn't waste any time to nod and say, "Deal. I'll get Haggis to bring my men and money to you tomorrow." "Not bad. I like doing business with people who don't haggle." Klein first heaved a sigh of relief before suspecting if his price was too low. After Klein left the general's residence, May Sanchez suddenly looked up and said to the person above, "Your Excellency Luca, is this the person you're waiting for?" One story above the beautiful staircase, a figure slowly appeared. He was an elder in a white robe with inlaid brass lines. His hair was completely white and neatly combed. His pair of gray-green eyes were so deep that they appeared bottomless. He replied with an unhurried tone, "There's no way to be certain. Although my prophecy tells me that I'll meet the person who can resolve my future predicament in the next 2 days here, that person was too ordinary. Besides being a beyonder, there's nothing worth taking note of. Of course, I can't tell the more profound truth. He might have an existence that's at least not weaker than me behind him." Having said that, he slowly walked down and, after a few seconds, said, "I'll attempt to use a dream to see if I can discover more. Do I need to prepare a special room for you?" May Sanchez asked reverently. Luca shook his head. "I'll use the activity room here." The best time will be 4 hours later. Don't disturb me before that happens." He then entered the room, sat down, and leaned against the sofa. He relaxed himself, closed his eyes, and fell silent. Only when it slowly turned dark did the old gentleman fall asleep. In the dream, he found himself standing in the hall of the general's residence, standing at the first floor of the beautiful staircase. By the side was May Sanchez and numerous guards. The middle-aged man named Dwayne Dantes was standing opposite him when he suddenly curled his lips into a smile, revealing an exaggerated smile. Flames soared up as poker cards fell from above. Luca's green eyes instantly darkened as Dwayne Dante's body instantly fell into a strange darkness that appeared. The old white-robed gentleman immediately spread his arms open, revealing a dark vortex at his chest. The vortex expanded and devoured Dwayne Dante's. Before Luca could confirm the situation, he felt something. He turned to the side and saw May Sanchez's face squirming and turning tall before instantly becoming another Dwayne Dante's. Almost at the same time, Haggis and all the guards present turned into Dwayne Dante's. All of them were casting their gaze at Luca. Luca was jolted awake, and under the watch of May Sanchez, who had entered at some point in time, he faltered for 2 seconds and said heavily, "I have to personally meet that gentleman from before and see the demigod behind him." Before he finished his sentence, he subconsciously turned his head to look out the window. At this moment, the street lamps lit up. It was dark outside, and the crimson moon's moonlight was strangely tainted with a bloody color. Another blood moon. Thankfully there's Mr. Fool. I must say that there are way too many blood moons this year. It's only been 2 months since the last time. I didn't even have any time to prepare. Furs, who sat up, wiped her cold sweat, and muttered silently. She had arrived at a town near Delaire Forest and had checked into a hotel. She shared a room with Zio, and they had made preparations to do some investigations of the abandoned castle early tomorrow morning. To Fur's surprise, there was a blood moon just as she was preparing to get some rest. At this moment, she seemed to recall something as her body stiffly turned to the side. Zio, who had exhorted her to sleep early, had already woken up at some point in time. She was looking at her with her eyes open. Chapter 954 Strange Ancient Castle. Fur's gaze met Zio's in midair as both parties remained silent. After a while, Furs chuckled dryly. "Huh, you haven't fallen asleep?" Zio frowned and said, "What happened to you?" "Nothing. Didn't I tell you before? Whenever the full moon happens, I won't be in a good state. It's even worse during the blood moon," Furs replied as though everything was normal. Zio sized her up and pulled her blanket. "I remember that you brought sleeping pills. There's no need for that. I'm fine now." Seeing that Zio wasn't pressing further, Furs secretly heaved a sigh of relief. "Go back to sleep. We still have to head into the forest early tomorrow morning." Zio didn't say another word as she turned around, gripped the blanket, and closed her eyes. Before long, her breathing turned heavier and became more drawn out and uniform. Furs stared blankly at the ceiling as her thoughts ran wild. At some point in time, she fell asleep as well. The next day at noon. In the core region of Delaire Forest, in front of a collapsed, ancient castle covered in green vines. Furs wiped the perspiration on her forehead and exhaled. "We're finally here," Zio shot her a glance and said, "The boss at the hotel told me that we only need 2 hours to get here." They had set off before 6 in the morning, but they had spent nearly 7 hours to arrive. The corners of Fur's lips twitched as she said, "Ideal conditions and reality are different. There weren't any trails for us to take towards the end. We needed to explore and forge a new path ourselves." Zio took out her triangular blade, nodded, and said, "You should have foreseen this from the beginning, but you refused to have a guide as suggested by the hotel's boss. As an astrologer, I don't believe such trivialities will cause any trouble. Look, aren't we there now? Besides, the time is perfect. The wraiths and ghosts are definitely in their weakest state." Having forced a smile, Furs held Lamino's travels in one hand as she pointed with the other. "I didn't notice it before, but the more I think about it, the more puzzled I become." "About what?" Zio also cast her gaze to the ancient abandoned castle that was covered by vines. Furs casually found an excuse. "Tell me, who would build a castle in the middle of a forest? Furthermore, they didn't open up a trail to it." Before she finished her sentence, she really found the matter a little odd. Zio thought and said, "Perhaps there was a trail, but after the castle was abandoned, whatever traces of it had been wiped out with time. Furs stroked the hair by her ear and shook her head. Then why would they abandon it? If they had considered safety back when building it, it would be more dangerous building it far from the town in an uninhabited castle. If it's just for vacations, with the way nobles do things, they wouldn't abandon it even if the maintenance and repairs are difficult. Xiao blurted out, could it be because it's haunted? Furs thought for a few seconds. Won't someone who can build such a huge castle hire beyonders to deal with the ghosts? I suspect that the three churches and the kingdom's government don't know of this ancient castle. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense that they will leave the beyonder ingredients inside. Upon saying that, she raised a possibility, an ancient castle of the sanguine? Such extraordinary creatures enjoyed living in places with few people. Furthermore, they were usually connected to dark forests and ancient castles. In addition, information about this ancient castle came from the sanguine to begin with. It's possible, Xiao first agreed before disagreeing. Will the sanguine be afraid of ghosts? They definitely have the means to deal with the ancient wraiths inside. Makes sense. Don't tell me those sanguine don't like money and don't care about the search for beyonder ingredients? Furs recalled Mr. Moon's behavior and denied her hypothesis. In deliberation, she said, unless there's some problem that's not easy to resolve. That's what made the bigwigs choose to skirt around it. In that case, her operation would become more dangerous than she had anticipated. Xiao tersely agreed. Let's do some preliminary investigations while the sun is still strong. All right. Furs held Lamino's travels and approached the half-collapsed ancient castle one step at a time. The two soon arrived at the entrance, which was two-thirds blocked by rocks. They discovered that, beneath the green vines, the stone walls were mottled and heavily weathered as though it had been in existence for a very, very long period of time. Xiao wasn't in a rush to enter. Calling out to Furs, they circled around the castle slowly. When they returned to the entrance, she said in puzzlement, this castle's style is purely defensive. It doesn't seem to consider the problems needed for living in it. Besides, many of the peculiarities of the building are ones I haven't heard of before. It has probably existed in the late 4th epoch or even earlier. What's there to defend again? Beastmen? Treants? They've all gone extinct after the cataclysm. Don't tell me that it's a building from the 2nd or 3rd epoch. Furs casually replied. She observed the terrain and left the entrance with Xiao before arriving at a relatively complete wall. She reached out her palm and pressed on it. Although she lacked combat experience, she was rather skilled when it came to the various aspects before a battle. An illusory light appeared in front of her, allowing Furs and Xiao to instantly enter the abandoned castle. The first thing that they saw was a collapsed staircase and layers of remnant concrete from above. There were rays of pure sunlight shining in from above, as well as masonry and rotten wood. There weren't any animal or bird feces or any green weeds on the ground. With a whoosh, the wind seeped into their bones, chilling them despite it being noon. Furs activated her spirit body and surveyed the area, but she failed to see any spirit bodies. However, she noticed that on the right of a remnant collapsed wall, there was a rather intact stone staircase. The staircase was mottled and scuffed as it extended downwards to an unknown location. Shall we head over there to take a look? Furs shot a glance at Xiao and made a suggestion. From her point of view, everything else in the castle could either be taken in at a glance or collapsed and stacked together. If they wished to do thorough investigations, it was certain that it would take a rather long amount of time. Therefore, it was better to gain a general understanding of the overall picture to assure themselves. Xiao glanced around and nodded gently. The cold wind is gathering underground. I suspect that all the wraiths and ghosts are hidden in the area where the staircase leads to. Yeah. Furs cautiously walked towards the mottled stone staircase and followed the steps, which were covered in gravel, down. The staircase was rather narrow, allowing only one person to pass at a time. Furthermore, they spiraled down, leaving Furs shaken. Tap. 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 As their footsteps echoed into the distance, the light that shone inside the staircase darkened. Xiao lit the lantern in her hand as Furs opened Lamino's Travels, swiping a page with great familiarity. A bright and warm light burst out, illuminating the mottled stairs ahead of them. Tensed, Furs and Xiao walked down one level at a time. On the way, cold wind blew past them, making them overreact and nearly caused them to launch attacks at non-existent enemies. Tap. 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 In the narrow and silent environment, Furs finally walked down the steps and stepped onto rather flat and solid ground. She had originally wanted to say, being in a place like this for too long will really make one go mad, but due to the silent and heavy atmosphere around her, she didn't make a sound. She was afraid that breaking the silence would result in extremely terrible developments. Using the blob of light that was floating above her, Furs cast her gaze forward in an attempt to see what was at the end of the staircase. It was a huge hall that was nearly 10 meters tall. There were black tiles laid on the ground with water droplets seeping out. There were signs of damage everywhere. Dozens of meters away, where the light nearly failed to illuminate the other end of the hall, there was a pair of double bronze doors sitting there silently. It went from the bottom to the top, and the rocks on the walls to its side had peeled off. The statues were in shambles, revealing the dark brown mud underneath. The surface of the door was engraved with dense symbols and strange patterns. They had a very mysterious and heavy feel, as though they were sealing something or blocking out something. Furs finally couldn't help but say with a hushed tone, "Have you seen such large doors before?" Beside her, Xiao shook her head. "No." Furs immediately drew a gasp. "Say, what could be behind that door? Where does it lead to? See, could it be the reason for building this castle in the first place? To prevent the creatures behind the door from coming out?" Xiao circled the area but didn't find any murals that could provide any information. All she found was that the closer she was to the bronze door, the more water seeped out from the ground. There were also more and more abandoned silver-black swords on the ground. During the 4th and 5th epoch, murals were very common in all castles and buildings. And before the cataclysm, it can be seen from various elvish ruins that supernatural creatures similarly like to use murals to praise their deities and to record their daily lives, Xiao said slowly, using her experience and knowledge from being a bounty hunter. Furs nodded slightly and said, "That's indeed the case. This ancient castle is more magical than I imagined." At this moment, she felt hesitant. She even had thoughts of leaving and seeking Mr. World's help. Having heard Little Sun describe so many horror stories when exploring abandoned ruins at the tarot gatherings, her mind couldn't help but wander when placed in a similar situation. She was scaring herself. "Perhaps we can gather more clues by going closer." Xiao boldly took a few steps forward and approached the heavy sealed door that seemed to lead somewhere. Furs gripped Lamino's Travels tightly and hurriedly chased after her. As she walked, she suddenly saw bright redness appear before her. What seeped out from the cracks of the black tiles was no longer water but staggering blood. This. Furs immediately flipped open the notebook with a bronze-green cover and cast her sight on Xiao through the corner of her eye. It was unknown when Xiao had turned pale. Her eyes were dark green, and her lips were red. The area around her was dark and gloomy as her expression looked extremely distorted. Chapter 955 Ancient Wraith. Furs's pupils dilated as though she was trying to absorb more light into her eyes to better see Xiao's current circumstances. Meanwhile, the light in front of her suddenly exploded with a flash several times more blinding than old-school cameras, blanketing the surroundings with whiteness. Following that, her finger swiped on a page on Lamino's Travels as black fog soared from her feet, enveloping her entire body. The thick black fog quickly transformed into palm-sized illusory bats as they flew in different directions of the underground hall. This was Wings of Darkness, which the moon had recorded in Lamino's travels. Its original use was to enhance one's speed and bestow temporary flight capabilities while producing a horde of blood-sucking bats to attack the enemy. However, Furs didn't use it for this purpose. Instead, she used it as a prop for her performance. After the illusory bats flew away, the space where Furs stood was already empty. At some point in time, she had appeared more than 10 meters away. After subconsciously escaping and defending herself, Furs could finally calm down as she hurriedly cast her gaze onto Xiao, who had turned abnormal. However, Xiao only appeared to have slightly disheveled blonde hair with malt-colored skin due to her continuous forays out in the sun. Besides looking somewhat blank as though she was surprised as to why her friend had such a huge reaction, she didn't show any signs of being influenced by wraiths or ghosts. Soares, what happened? Xiao asked warily. Furs narrowed her eyes without directly replying to her. Flipping through Lamino's Travels' pages, she asked, Xiao, how tall are you? Seemingly realizing something, Xiao answered, 152. Isn't that so? Just as she said that, Furz's fingers slid across the notebook's page, which was filled with symbols and magical labels. Silently, a holy light swirling with fire plummeted down from above. The unadulterated and bright light instantly enveloped Xiao before rippling outward with sunlight. As the blazing light stabbed into Furz's eyes, she saw the hall collapse and the surrounding space shatter like glass. This feeling was gone in a flash as Furs realized that she was still in her original spot. She had yet to flee. That was an illusion. She hurriedly turned to the side and saw Xiao looking at the damaged region of the heavy door. Furs deliberated for a moment and asked, Xiao, how tall are you? Xiao glanced at her and angrily said, stop asking such inane questions. Phew, she's real. Furs heaved a sigh of relief as she quickly described her encounter to Xiao. After a few seconds of thought, Xiao used her lantern-wielding hand to nudge Furz's arm. Let's retreat. Perhaps the closer we are to that door, the easier it is to hallucinate. Yes, that's possible. Furs nodded in agreement as she quickly moved back a few steps. Following that, she surveyed the area and asked in puzzlement, why can't we find any wraiths or ghosts here? Such an environment should be something that they enjoy. Xiao was perplexed as well. She then did a careful observation before landing her gaze on the blob of sunlight floating above Furz's head. Try extinguishing it, she suggested. Furs came to a realization as she immediately dispelled the light. Silent darkness blanketed the area and ruled the underground hall once more. Only the lantern's faint yellow light put up a resistance against all of this. Then, Furs saw two figures in her spirit vision. They were rather close to the bronze door. One was a female with coiled hair, wearing a knight's trousers and a garish shirt for ease of movement. The other was a man wearing silver-black armor as he held a sword that was almost snapping due to rust. The former's face was a blur as it kept wandering between the door and where Furs and Xiao arrived. The latter was loitering beside the door, muttering something. These are the two ancient wraiths? Furs nudged Xiao and said with a suppressed voice, I see spirit bodies. I see them as well. They aren't hiding at all. Xiao curved her back as she readied herself for a fight. Furs hurriedly nudged her. Don't be hasty. We aren't sure that they're the targets. She attempted to take 3 steps forward, but the two relatively blurry figures didn't even look at her. Furs thought and suddenly said, Ma'am, what are you doing? She had heard of stories in other mysticism circles that wraiths, shadows, and other higher-level spirit-body creatures could be communicated with. However, she regretted it the moment she said that. This was because communication didn't allow her to achieve her goal. There was no way she could persuade the other party to kill themselves and hand over the cursed item and remnant spirituality of an ancient wraith. Just as Furs was considering if she should launch a direct attack, the lady in the garish shirt and knight's trousers replied with a flat tone, I'm searching for my husband. He's a guard here. Communication is really possible. Furs pressed out of curiosity, where did he go? At this moment, Xiao approached as she wore a look of extreme vigilance. The blurry-figured lady answered blankly, he's a guard here. He told me that magical power seeps out from behind the door, corrupting his teammates. He got me to leave as quickly as possible with a messenger. He said that he would ensure that I escaped safely, but I don't wish for that. I want to leave with him. After sending off the messenger, I returned midway and returned underground. But I can't find him. With the age of this castle exceeding the present epoch, the last defender has definitely transformed into an ancient wraith. This lady's story has moved me. I really can't bear to attack her. Furz's mind whirled as she carefully took a few steps and circled around the ancient female wraith and approached the bronze door. This time, she and Xiao didn't suffer any more hallucinations. This seemed to imply that her encounter was subconsciously created by the lady. A distance from the silver-black armored knight with a rusty sword, Furs attempted to ask, Sir, what are you doing? The knight paused and said with a humming voice, I'm guarding this door of blackness. I need to ensure that my wife has escaped safely. If you meet her, tell her that her knight will fight for her to the very last moment. Door of blackness. It's clearly a bronze door. Wait, what did he say? He said that he's guarding the door to ensure that his wife can safely escape. Isn't this the other half of that woman's story which she described? This is her husband? Furs was taken aback as she kept looking back and forth between the two ancient wraiths. The lady wearing a garish shirt and knight's trousers slowly approached the bronze door before returning to the middle of the hall repeatedly. As for the silver-black armored man, he was patrolling about the door with a rotting sword in hand. At times, they would pass by without noticing each other. Such a scene must have gone on for at least 1,500 years, or even longer. Furs commented silently as she turned to glance at Xiao. She realized that her friend's eyes were already welling with tears. What an easily touched person. Furs couldn't help it as she shouted at the female wraith, look at the door. Your husband has been there all along. The lady slowed down her pace and first glanced at Furs before casting her gaze at the heavy door. Her blank gaze penetrated the knight, landing behind him. Why can't I find him? The wraith repeated her words and repeated her actions. Furs felt an inexplicable sense of sorrow, and just as she was about to shout again, she saw the knight turn to look at her and Xiao. He shouted, Who are you? Just as he said that, the female wraith cast her gaze at Xiao and Furs again. Furs immediately felt her thoughts slow down as a coldness quickly formed inside her body and rippled out, freezing her flesh and joints. As for Xiao, she too was suffering from the same condition. The area around the lantern dimmed significantly. At this moment, 2 bolts of lightning lit up in Xiao's eyes. This made the wraith let out a painful cry as his body turned faint. Xiao instantly escaped from her frozen state and threw out the triangular blade in her hand towards the female wraith. Bolts of illusory lightning swirled around the triangular blade's tip, stabbing straight into the lady. Psychic lashing. The female wraith screamed as her body turned faint. Furs instantly snapped awake as she slid her fingers across the open Lamino's travels. Life seemed to immediately gather from the surrounding shadows, turning into a pitch-black chain that restrained the male wraith to the ground, sealing off his mouth. Abyss chains. Meanwhile, Xiao rushed out, and with an illusory brand in hand, she stamped it on the female wraith. With her holding back the female wraith, Furz's actions became more composed. She flipped through Lamino's travels and slid her fingers. Silver lightning that branched out and blasted out of thin air, smiting the male wraith and turning the area into a lightning hellscape. Finally, a holy pillar of light that had flames swirling around it appeared. It enveloped the male wraith and completely purified him. With one enemy taken down, Furs immediately turned and dealt with the female wraith with Xiao. She didn't hold back on using powers from Lamino's travels. She came up with wise combinations of them, and using Xiao's suppression, she switched between restrainment powers and offense from time to time. Soon, they finished off their target. Everything fell silent as Furs heaved a sigh of relief. She then looked at the battlefield with a look of disbelief. Is that it? She originally imagined that two ancient wraiths had unique powers, and with their higher levels, they weren't something subsequence 5 Beyonders could deal with. However, she realized that everything happened rather smoothly. This made her truly realize how godly Lamino's travels was. She also began looking forward to the next sequence as a scribe. Xiao was somewhat astonished as she thought for a few seconds. It's no wonder someone told me that, beneath the level of demigods, the number of Beyonders, their cooperation, and usage of powers are more important than the sequence. Just as she said that, she heard knocking sounds resonate. It broke the silence of the hall, and it came from behind the bronze door. Chapter 956 The things behind the door bang. 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 Behind the bronze door, the slamming sounds continued incessantly, echoing throughout the vast underground hall as though they came from an abnormally distant past. Furs clamped up and couldn't help but tremble. Unable to help it, she suppressed her voice. What could be behind the door? I've no idea. Xiao honestly shook her head, subconsciously gulping. Her right hand, which had just picked up her triangular blade, had her joints protruding out as her blood vessels surfaced. Clearly, she was gripping the triangular blade tightly. Bang! 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 The slamming sounds continued without any change in frequency. Each sound seemed to strike at Furz's and Xiao's hearts, leaving their hair standing and scalps tingling. It likely won't be able to come out, right? If it could so easily come out, it wouldn't have waited until today. Furs tried to console herself with parched lips. Xiao nodded heavily and said, "We leave once the ingredients form." In such an environment and atmosphere, her curiosity had been completely overwhelmed by her innate fear. All right. As Furs glanced at the spots where the two ancient wraiths had been cleansed, she blamed the moon for providing undetailed information. He hadn't mentioned that there was such a strange door beneath the ancient castle. At this moment, glowing dust was landing on the ground like shattered gems, forming into two piles as they gathered together. Around them, nearly formless remnant spirituality condensed into a seemingly ethereal crystal. Accompanied by the crystals and dust were two different items. One was ring-shaped and completely transparent as though it was a corroded ring. The other was an eye carved from crystal, with faint black gas swirling within. Upon seeing this scene, Furs suddenly realized something. An ancient wraith was a ghost-like creature with a Beyonder characteristic mixed in. The cursed item would be related to a particular item while they were still alive, fusing with the characteristic and turning into a foundation to which they relied on for their existence. It was precisely because of this that different ancient wraiths had different corresponding cursed items in shape and form. However, they were essentially the same. And the dust was another type of characteristic. It was the source of most of their strength, stemming from remnant spirituality, slightly equivalent to the blood and ingredients of monsters. Bang! 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 The entity striking behind the bronze door didn't let up at all. It kept testing Furz's and Xiao's psyche. Being afraid and cautious, the duo's bodies trembled so much that they even imagined that the door was shaking slightly. Their racing hearts were in their throats. With them being able to head for the staircase at any moment, Furs finally waited until the ancient wraith's powder and cursed items took form. As she signaled to Xiao to be wary, she crouched down and took out 3 square metal boxes she had prepared. After some hesitation, Furs looked up at Xiao and said, "These two ancient wraiths have been waiting for each other for so long. I am thinking of separating a little of what they left behind and burying them together. In that case, I'll get a cursed item, and you'll get a pile of dust. We'll split the remaining spirituality, alright? Xiao didn't hesitate as she nodded. Alright. Furs silently heaved a sigh of relief as she pursed her lips. Flipping through Lamino's travels, she slid her finger across a particular page. The 5 nails on her right hand immediately grew long and sharp, covering black patterns and symbols. This was the claw of corrosion from the sanguine. Upon seeing her palm transform, Furs grabbed at the ground, easily digging a hole and leaving behind a corrosive mark. Right on the heels of that, she placed the crystal eyeball-like cursed item and a pile of dust into the hole before filling the hole with the gravel and soil she had dug up. She lightly grazed the flattened ground with her fingernails, writing an epitaph. Returning for you, defending for you, together forever. After doing all of this, Furs sighed when she heard the slamming behind the bronze turn louder. Bam! She jumped in fright and hurriedly placed the pile of dust, ring-shaped curse item, and remnant spirituality into the different square metal boxes. Then, she put the boxes away, stood up, and slowly walked to the spiraling and cramped staircase with Xiao. Bang! 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 The slamming sounds behind the bronze door grew intense as Furs and Xiao subconsciously gritted their teeth, following the staircase and rapidly heading up. They increased their speed until they began running. They ignored the possibility of falling on the staircase and tumbling down like a wheel. Finally, Furs and Xiao saw sunlight. Sunlight beamed in from outside, shining upon the staircase ahead of them. It was bright, pure, and warm. At this moment, the slamming sounds from underground had come to a sudden stop without any follow-up. Furs and Xiao exchanged looks, slowed down their pace, and after a few large strides, returned to the top of the abandoned ancient castle. The duo didn't say a word and directly left the area, returning to the periphery of the forest. After walking for some time, Furs calmed down and pursed her lips. It was really terrifying. Although the thing behind the bronze door didn't deal any harm to us, nor did it even show itself, I think it was more terrifying than the ancient wraiths. Compared to all my past experiences, it's far more terrifying. In those few minutes, I couldn't help but imagine all the different tragic deaths I might suffer. Each one was more terrifying than the last, but none of them were as terrifying as the slamming sounds. Xiao turned her head and agreed with a nod. Yeah. I felt as though I was walking on the edge of a cliff. Furs was about to continue when she saw 2 streams of bright red blood flowing down Xiao's nose. Xiao, Xiao. Your nose is bleeding. Furs hurriedly warned her friend. Xiao was taken aback as her pupils dilated. You too? Furs blankly reached out her hand and wiped her nose. It felt warm to the touch, wet and sticky. She was appalled as she hurriedly held her right hand in front of her and saw red blood smeared across it. It was bright and striking. A result from being overly anxious? Furs muttered in puzzlement. At this moment, through the sunlight diffusing through the forest's canopy, she realized that faint black spots were quickly growing on her wrists at a discernible pace. The black spots rapidly spread, covering her arms and the back of her hands. Ah! Furs subconsciously cried out as she hurriedly looked at Xiao. She saw Xiao's cheeks and neck covered with black spots. This isn't normal. Furs blurted out. Xiao sensed the abnormality happening to the both of them as she recalled and said, "Do you still remember what that female wraith said?" She said that the guards from before had been corrupted by the forces that seeped out from behind the bronze door. Could it be that we've been corrupted? Furs was taken aback for a second before she nodded heavily. It's possible. She hurriedly took out the medicine that she had prepared, handing over some of it to Xiao. Then, she twisted the lid off and downed 2 bottles. However, they didn't show any signs of recovering. The black spots grew in number, turning their vision blurry. Ba-dump. Ba-dump. Before long, Furs, whose efforts to save herself were in vain, could hear her heartbeat and sense her body beginning to lose strength. Out of ideas, she quivered her lips, clenched her teeth, and turned her body around. She took a few steps to open up a distance from Xiao. Then, she bowed her head and chanted Mr. Fool's honorific name. In about 10 seconds, she saw dark red light appear, engulfing her like the tide. The ravings and roaring vanished and Furs saw the familiar model table and the 10 high-back chairs opposite her. She then realized that her dizziness and blurred vision had vanished. There weren't any more of the strange, accentuated black spots on her spirit body. "Thank you for your help." Furs hurriedly stood up and bowed at the figure shrouded in gray fog at the end of the long bronze table. Then, she heard Mr. Fool say in a calm tone, "Your spirit had been corrupted by some force. It should be fine now." Cleansed by Mr. Fool? Furs's heart stirred. Just as she wanted to make a request to Mr. Fool regarding how Xiao could be saved, the scene before turned red as light soared up. After a brief pause, she found herself in the real world, back in Delaire Forest. The black spots on the back of her hands and wrists were rapidly fading and receding. The blood that kept dripping from her nose had already come to a stop. Returning to her body, she saw Xiao weakly slumped on a tree. Her face was covered in black spots, making her look terrifying. The muscles on both sides of her neck were tensed up as her mind spun. A few seconds later, she walked over quickly, pressed Xiao on the shoulders and rapidly said, "I have a way to save you, but you need to follow my instructions." Use ancient Hermes to say this, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. Xiao could hardly turn her swollen eyelids. Looking at Furs for 2 seconds, she heavily chanted, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Just as she said that, Xiao saw dark red starlight surge out from the void, sweeping over her. Indescribable roars continued for a second before vanishing from Xiao's ears. She then saw herself seated in an ancient and majestic palace. She was sitting beside a mottled, bronze table. At her feet was a boundless grayish-white fog. In front of her was a lofty figure looking down upon her. This scene was both unfamiliar and familiar to her. She had once seen it in a dream, but she hadn't ever had it again after the exorcism ritual. That purification was actually useless. Xiao suddenly had this thought as she stood up in deliberation, bowing at the figure enshrouded in gray fog. "You are the great king of yellow and black?" She didn't appear too surprised or alarmed, as though she had already expected it. "You can call me Mr. Fool." "Have a seat," the figure with an epic aura replied calmly. Xiao bowed again and sat down, confirming that she had escaped her unwell state. She looked to her sides and thought before asking, "Honorable Mr. Fool, does Furs Wall have a seat here?" Shrouded in the gray fog, the fool nodded gently and said, "Yes." Xiao fell silent for a second and directly asked, "Can I join just like her?" The fool chuckled. "It's a gathering they organized on their own accord but is convened by me. There's still a seat available at present. You may join. Draw a card." They use one of the major arcana cards as their code name. Xiao didn't ask or speak further. She immediately nodded. "Yes, Mr. Fool." On the bronze table in front of her, a deck of tarot cards immediately appeared. Xiao reached out her right hand and solemnly cut the deck, pulled out one card, and flipped it over. Her card depicted an angel with a trumpet and the sleeping dead awaiting salvation, the Judgment card. Chapter 957. Getting to know each other. Looking at the Judgment card in hand, Xiao was taken aback. "This greatly meets my expectations." Shrouded in the gray fog, the fool nodded and calmly said, "The gathering is held here at 3 in the afternoon on Mondays, Backlund time. Be prepared. During the gathering, you can exchange information, ingredients, formulas, and knowledge. You can also pay a certain price to entrust missions to the other members. Xiao recalled for a moment before nodding in enlightenment. Yes, Mr. Fool. Believing that this was all for the day, she heard the voice coming from the end of the bronze table. What did you do before being corrupted by that force? We really were corrupted. Xiao composed herself and completely recounted her exploration of the ancient castle with furs. She emphasized the bronze door which had been named the Door of Blackness, as well as the ancient castle's guard that had been reduced to a wraith due to the corruption. Then, she noticed Mr. Fool nod slightly as he said calmly, "Don't enter that ancient castle again before you reach sequence 4. It's time for you to return." Xiao then got up, and following the descriptions in the religious rituals, she bowed and said, "Your wish is my wish." Just as she said that, the dark red color surged in front of her. After everything dissipated, she was back in the real world and leaning against a thick tree. Subconsciously looking at the back of her hand, she realized that the black spots were rapidly turning faint. Xiao looked up at Furs, who was staring at her worriedly. As their gazes met, Furs was first delighted before revealing a smile. She opened her mouth but was at a loss for words. Xiao slowly exhaled and pointed ahead. "Let's first return to the town." "All right." Furs answered without any hesitation. At this moment above the grey fog, the fool Klein was tapping on the edge of the model table as he considered Miss Magician and Miss Judgment's encounter. The object or power sealed behind the Door of Blackness could still corrupt the guards and explorers outside, even without escaping. Just the mere thought of it was terrifying. Furthermore, this corruption stemmed from the spirit body. To resolve it, Klein had only two solutions. One was to make the corrupted entity hold a complete secret deed ritual as he used the powers above the grey fog and the sun brooch to complete a purification. The other was to directly pull the spirit body over, using the grey fog to cleanse them. As he didn't have the luxury of time, he had chosen the latter. What could it be? The most corruptive power belongs to the devil pathway. That place connects to the abyss? That's not impossible. Based on Little Sun's description, during the early and mid stages of the Second Epoch, devils often left the abyss and were active over the land. It was only when the ancient sun god appeared, causing ancient gods to perish one after another, did they retreat into the abyss and seal themselves in. Based on that, it's rather normal to have an underground ancient entrance in the northern continent to lead to the abyss. It can also be imagined that a castle is built with men sent to watch over it. But the problem lies in the fact that it's been millennia. Why would there still be an existence slamming the door? Are the devils planning on returning? Klein made a preliminary guess. He temporarily had no plans on exploring the abandoned castle to verify his thoughts, because it was unlikely that there would be any changes anytime soon. After all, since it was news that came from the Sanguine, he could get the Moon Emlyn to do some gathering of information to figure out the history of the castle. Reigning in this thought, Klein removed the topaz chain from his wrist and divined if the matter regarding the ancient castle was pressing. He received a negative answer. He immediately returned to the real world and waited for the local ruler, General May Sanchez, to send over the down payment. At 2 in the afternoon, Fainapotter time, Haggis, with his hair combed backward while dressed as a northern continent gentleman, carried a black leather suitcase with a team of guards as he knocked on Dwayne Dantes' door. "Please come on in." A warm and elegant voice sounded from the inside. It was first Loanese in a Backlund accent before it was changed to the local language of Dudanese. Haggis turned the doorknob and entered. He saw Dwayne Dantes with his white sideburns and deep, blue eyes stand up from his reclining chair while pressing down the ends of his black vest. "Good afternoon, my friend." This lone gentleman with good looks and bearings took 2 steps forward and extended his right palm. This time, he switched to using Loanese. Haggis replied using the accent of a Loanese noble, "It's my honor to be your friend." After he shook hands with Dwayne Dantes, he surveyed the area and chuckled. "Is this your servant?" He pointed at a mixed-blood youth standing behind the arms dealer. In between the lines, he was asking if he was trustworthy. After all, Dwayne Dantes hadn't brought any servants back when he visited the general's residence yesterday. Yes, his greatest strength is the ability to keep secrets. Dwayne Dantes smiled as he pointed to the leather sofa across the reclining chair. With 2 guards following Haggis, he closed the door and sat down. He then said with a smile, "I've heard of an Intis proverb that's said to be from Emperor Roselle. He said that dead men tell no tales." Dwayne Dantes said with a laugh. "Emperor Roselle also said something else, corpses can speak." "Is that so?" "This is my first time hearing of this." Haggis enjoyed conversing with a northern continent gentleman, so they continued their conversation for a while before he lifted up the leather suitcase beside him and opened it. At that instant, there seemed to be overflowing golden lusters. Under the illumination from the sunlight outside, the entire room seemed to brighten significantly. Haggis then looked at Dwayne Dantes and said, 5,000 lone gold pounds, as well as 5,000 gold coins and gold bars. This is the down payment. I'll bring along the remaining 30,000 pounds in cash and gold the entire time, and will hand it over when the arms deal is completed. Dwayne Dantes scanned the stacks of cash, the gold coins, and gold bars in the leather suitcase before retracting his gaze and saying with a smile, "When do we set off?" Haggis closed the leather suitcase and handed it to Dwayne Dantes' servant and said simply, "Tomorrow morning." He paused for 2 seconds before saying, "Mr. Dantes, the general has a guest who would like to meet you." Dwayne Dantes' expression didn't change as he fell silent for a few seconds. "When?" "Now," Haggis said without daring to show any signs of being perfunctory. "He's downstairs." Dwayne Dantes nodded slightly. "Please invite him up." Haggis immediately heaved a sigh of relief and left with his guards. They followed the stairwell down. Before long, Luca, in a simple white robe with brass lines adorning it, walked up. His silver hair had been combed very neatly. When he arrived by Dwayne Dantes' door, he heard a voice from the inside just as he raised his hand. "Please come in." This time they spoke using ancient Faceac. Luca's expression didn't change as he naturally pushed open the door. He then saw the middle-aged gentleman who had rather good looks and qualities from yesterday standing beside a reclining chair facing him. And sitting on the reclining chair was a young man. He had black hair and brown eyes, with a thin, cut face. He had a cold temperament. Luca was taken aback as he took a step forward, entered the room, and closed the door. After he sat down on the sofa in a composed manner, his gray-green eyes clearly reflected the young man in front of him. "Gehrman Sparrow?" Luca addressed him with a rhetorical question. Gehrman Sparrow curled the corners of his mouth. Directly addressing others by their full name is impolite. Luca nodded and said, "My apologies for my faux pas. I recall that you advanced to sequence 5 less than half a year ago, or it might have only been 3 months. Yes, it should have been completed when you were in the ruins of the battlefield of gods. I never expected that you were already a demigod. It left me a little bewildered." Gehrman Sparrow smiled without giving any explanations. After a brief moment of silence, he said in an unhurried tone, "Why are you visiting me?" Luca calmly replied, "I don't know." The atmosphere in the room suddenly turned somewhat odd. Gehrman Sparrow seemed to forget that there was an elderly man sitting opposite him that needed him to speak again. Luca indiscernibly nodded and said, "This is the thing, I made a prophecy by chance not too long ago. In that prophecy, I will be in a rather thorny situation in the future. And one of the people I met with over these few days will help me deal with it. I'm not sure if it's you, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. So I decided to meet you and get to know each other. My name is Luca Brewster, a clergyman who serves the God of knowledge and wisdom. I'm presently in charge of various matters in West Balam. Gehrman Sparrow nodded and said, "Not bad. I now know you. I don't believe I need to introduce myself, right?" "Of course," Luca thought and said. "You should be a bizarro sorcerer. I recently received some intel that there has been some reshuffling among the secret order in Intis." He didn't see Gehrman Sparrow reveal any looks of shock. This powerful adventurer, who was famous across the 5 seas, said after a moment of silence, "Zeradal has returned." The look in Luca's eyes changed immediately before being restored to normal. Then, he stood up and nodded. "Since we've gotten to know each other, it's time we bid farewell." After saying this, he walked to the door, twisted the doorknob, and left the room. Sitting on the reclining chair, Gehrman Sparrow watched as his figure was concealed inch by the wooden door until he completely disappeared. Then, he chuckled. What a charlatan. Yes. Dwayne Dantes, who was standing beside the reclining chair, found a seat and sat down. Then, he picked up a cup of tea and sipped from it. With white sideburns and deep blue eyes, he and the thin, angular-faced Gehrman Sparrow exchanged looks and smiled in unison. On Monday afternoon, Dwayne Dantes took out his golden pocket watch, opened it, and said to Haggis opposite him, "We're almost arriving at our destination. I believe you and your men need some rest." An excellent suggestion. Haggis was rather agreeable. Dwayne Dantes pointed at the street ahead. "There's a hotel ahead. Let's rest there for half a day before we set off again tomorrow." Haggis didn't object to it as he turned to the front and instructed the carriage driver. After checking into the hotel, Dwayne Dantes declined Haggis's invitation for afternoon tea by using an afternoon nap as an excuse. Slightly more than half an hour later, above the boundless gray fog, Klein sat in the seat belonging to the Fool. Chapter 958. Labeling. Dark red beams shot up, materializing into different figures on both sides of the long bronze table. The unchanging silence above the gray fog was broken as the eternal palace seemed to have an additional, inexplicable sense of life to it. Just as Justice Audrey regained her senses of her surroundings, she prepared to stand up to greet the existence at the end of the long bronze table. At this moment, as a senior spectator, she acutely noticed a difference. There were 2 more members than last week. One of them was a man sitting to the right of Mr. Moon. The other was a lady sitting to the left of the Hermit. Audrey first felt happy that the Tarot Club was developing and becoming stronger, but then she kept to her professional instincts and quickly began observing. Due to where she sat, the man opposite her was much easier to observe compared to the lady 2 seats away from her. Therefore, she placed her attention on the man. Black hair. Green eyes. He doesn't wear a coat. A vest matched with a shirt. He sits a little oddly. He's not accustomed to sitting properly. He's probably about 180 centimeters tall. He has quite a desultory temperament. He's rather tense. At one glance, Justice Audrey had read plenty of information from the rather blurry figure. She then noticed something different. The man was quickly surveying his surroundings. Such an action wasn't a problem in itself. Anyone who came to this strange and secret location would definitely subconsciously size up the other members and attempt to grasp their traits and general situation so as to calm down. But the problem was that the man was moving his gaze too quickly. His gaze had swept past the moon, the hanged man, and the other members without pausing. To Audrey, this was a very clear phenomenon. It didn't mean that the man was observing his surroundings and studying the members, but that he was finding someone. He was looking for someone he had in mind. Audrey instantly felt a little excited, as she believed that this newcomer knew one of the members present. Who could it be? She observed for another second and realized that the man sitting diagonally opposite her had fixed his gaze on the world Gehrman Sparrow. Audrey was thrilled as though she had discovered a secret. She thought in enlightenment, the newcomer is a friend of Mr. World, or it's at least the case that they know each other in the real world. He also knows that he's a tarot club member. Or it could also be said that Mr. World had inducted him into the gathering. No, that's not very possible. If that were the case, the newcomer would be much more certain. He wouldn't be eagerly searching for someone he knows. He definitely would have placed his gaze on the other members for a longer period of time. Furthermore, such an action also proves that he's not a blessed of Mr. Fool. What is his relationship with Mr. World? Audrey held on to her thoughts of continuing to observe as she stood up and turned to face the seat of honor. During this process, she took the opportunity to sweep her gaze at the new member sitting beside Ma'am Hermit. She's exchanging looks with Miss Magician. Her height. Xiao has finally passed the test and joined the gathering? Upon identifying her, Audrey did a curtsy towards the figure shrouded in grey fog. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. Just as she issued the brisk greeting, she realized something. Mr. Fool is a little different from before. This great existence seemed to be more one with the entire grey fog, palace, and space. His aura was lofty and mighty, like the sea or sky. This feeling isn't something that can be described with words. Mr. Fool has taken one more step to his awakening, allowing him to retrieve more of his authority over his divine kingdom. Audrey's eyes darted around, feeling curious and delighted, as well as a little sense of pride. At this moment, the hanged man Alger and the hermit Catlia had noticed the two new members. They noticed that the lady was a little short and was secretly exchanging signals with Miss Magician. She was both unfamiliar but also familiar with the tarot gathering. At the very least, she was unlike the man in the white shirt and black vest. He had frantically stood up only after everyone began bowing. In addition, they sensed that the new male member took special notice of the World Gehrman Sparrow, causing them to have many guesses. These thoughts resonated in their minds, but they didn't express them. The hanged man and the hermit completed the usual first steps of the gathering with Miss Justice. As for the son Derek, he was just happy because the tarot club had new members again. The moon Emlyn had mixed feelings. On the one hand, he felt a sense of superiority being more senior compared to the newcomers, but on the other hand, he had a feeling that there were just too many messiahs for the apocalypse. After some searching, the star Leonard determined that the one sitting at the bottom end of the long bronze table was Klein Moretti. This was because his physical characteristics were similar to that of Gehrman Sparrow's description. He's hiding his true identity. He doesn't relax even in such a secretive gathering, using 2 levels of disguises. I have to take note. Just as this thought flashed across his mind, Leonard saw the girl sitting to the left of Mr. Fool stand up. Then, she led everyone into bowing. He was taken aback, failing to react in time. He stood out when amongst all the standing members. After a second, Leonard snapped back to his senses and hurriedly stood up to deliver the greeting. Opposite him, Xiao glanced at him, equating him to Furs to a certain extent. Furs shared the same thought, however, she had equated the man with Xiao to a certain extent. This was because Xiao had appeared rather unreliable when they first met. This is the star, and this is judgment. Take your seats and introduce yourself. The fool Klein raised his right hand and casually pointed. The name, the star, keeps making me think that it's the code name for a lady. As Leonard thought in exasperation, he focused and began labeling the members in the order of their introduction. Miss Justice. Seems like a young lady, but she might have donned 2 levels of disguise like Klein. She's rather optimistic and cheerful. Although I can't tell the details of her attire, it appears to be very classy. Mr. Hanged Man Burly, restrained. He's likely to be a straightforward but rash person. Miss Magician. The way she looks at me is weird. From time to time, she will glance at Klein. I've no idea what's on her mind. She seems rather ordinary overall with nothing standing out. Mr. Sunday. He's very tall, but the way he speaks sounds like he's going through puberty. Although he's silent, he does seem rather friendly. Miss Hermit, Ma'am Hermit. She exudes a mature and staid demeanor. She's likely a very experienced beyonder. Mr. Moon. Rather young and looks a little reserved. Makes me feel like I've seen him somewhere before, but I can't recall it. I'll continue observing. Misjudgment. Very short with very obvious traits. However, I can't be sure if she has donned 2 levels of disguises. The world. Very, very gloomy. This is likely his disguise. Well, it might also be his true nature. He wasn't a demigod before, meaning that this gathering has no lack of mid-sequence beyonders. I wonder if I'm the weakest one. As Leonard was observing the other members, Judgment Xiao Dericha was also using her powers as a sheriff to extract the traits of the different members and keeping them in mind. A noble lady. Sailor or a crew member. Rather young and introverted, but it's not serious. Rather strong. The leader of at least a mid-sized team. Arrogant, of pretty good family background. Desultory, not staid. Gloomy, terrifying. Amidst their thoughts, the other members finished their self-introduction. The hermit Catlia looked towards the end of the long bronze table and said with a bow, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I didn't receive any new Roselle diary pages this time." Didn't receive. Does this mean that Queen Mystic didn't reply? I wonder what Bernadette is busy with. The Fool Klein nodded and calmly replied, "Begin the transactions then." As he said that, Audrey noticed the reactions of the hermit and the hanged man. She realized that they had yet to notice Mr. Fool turning loftier and sublime. Was I the only one who noticed it? Audrey darted her eyes slightly in thought, feeling somewhat poignant and a little happy. Of course, she also knew that Ma'am Hermit and Mr. Hanged Man didn't dare to look at Mr. Fool too much, especially the former. Most of the time, she only dared to look at the table edge in front of Mr. Fool. Table edge. There's an additional card of blasphemy. Audrey's gaze froze before she retracted it in pleasant surprise. With her intuition as a spectator, she was quite certain that the obtaining of the new card of blasphemy was likely to be the same matter as the World Gehrman Sparrow's mental problems but with different outcomes. She hesitated for a moment and observed the area. I have nothing I need. Catlia, Derek, Emlyn, and Furs had already made preparations and were about to advance, therefore, they didn't have any requests. Likewise for Alger, who was still digesting his potion. Instead, it was Leonard who had the desire to purchase a mystical item. However, with no one showing him an example, he was momentarily unsure how to begin. All he could do was divert some attention to considering Mr. Fool's need for Roselle diaries. After selling tinder, he wasn't lacking in money. Furthermore, having had the experience using creeping hunger, he realized that having a powerful mystical item was rather useful. At this point, Furs looked at the silent Xiao before looking opposite her. Mr. Hanged Man, I have a material that I wish to be made into a mystical item by that artisan. She was referring to the ancient wraith powder that Xiao had. Alger shook his head. That artisan has been controlled by some members of the Rose School of Thought who believe in the primordial moon. That's all I know. The subsequent matters have been left to Ma'am Hermit to handle. Rose School of Thought. Primordial moon believers. Left to Ma'am Hermit to handle. Leonard and Xiao looked around and suddenly realized that the gathering they were participating in wasn't as loose as they imagined. They were secretly traversing through the shadows of the world. Chapter 959. Even newcomers are different amongst themselves. Catlia turned her body slightly to the side and looked at the magician. It's a little complicated. I suggest that you wait for another 1 to 2 weeks. I'm unable to promise anything. All I can say is that there should be someone to help you create the mystical item when the time comes. Should be someone. It also means that it might not be the original artisan. Does this mean that she's planning on nurturing an artisan for herself? Or could it be that she's thinking of a way to turn the original artisan into a sealed artifact, using a machine to create machines? Ma'am Hermit is indeed an experienced beyonder. Leonard listened quietly while doing some analysis. It was the first time he was this serious during a meeting. No problem. Furs had the utmost confidence in Ma'am Hermit. After all, she had already obtained the mythical creature's blood and was likely to undergo a qualitative change in time. At this moment, she heard the world say with a hoarse voice, "If this matter requires my help, you can get my help." To Klein, the mother tree of Desire's abnormal interest in the grey fog, as well as Emperor Roselle's warning to "be careful of the moon," which made him, who was determined to figure out the secret of transmigration and the door of light, take note of matters involving the Rose School of Thought and the primordial moon believers more than ever before. Furthermore, the artisan was now involved in both matters. Cadlia never expected the world to offer his help. After some silence, she nodded slightly. "All right. If I'm unable to handle it, I'll seek your help through Mr. Fool." She had deliberately said, "through Mr. Fool," to inform the two newcomers that the Tarot Club had a magical way of contacting one another. There was no need for them to be stumped or be in a dilemma in such aspects. It was something they would understand in due time. As the pirate admiral with the highest bounty across the 5 seas, and as a pirate crew leader of hundreds of subordinates, she wasn't doing this solely out of goodwill, nor was she worried that the two newcomers would affect the progress of the gathering because of excessive questions. Instead, it was a way to assert dominance in front of newcomers. Of course, unless time was of the essence, leaving Cadlia no time to set up a ritual, she would in fact rather summon Gehrman Sparrow's messenger than trouble Mr. Fool. Seek help through Mr. Fool. Zio vaguely understood something and held back her urge to look at Furs. Seek help through Mr. Fool? Leonard's thoughts raced quickly as he made a guess. Seeing that someone had begun, he relaxed a little and deliberated for a few seconds. Then, he said, "I need a mystical item." "What kind?" Audrey answered at the perfect time to prevent an awkward atmosphere from descending upon the area. Leonard verbally showed his indecision and subconsciously replied, "I don't know." He only had such a plan, but he hadn't thought carefully into the details. He only realized that there was this possibility after being pulled into the gathering. Doesn't know. Is he an idiot? The fool Klein, who knew Leonard's desultoriness and casualness, resisted the urge to laugh and criticized him inwardly. Seeing everyone's gaze fall on him with mixed expressions, Leonard immediately felt embarrassed as he hurriedly added, "I mean, there are no limits on the type. As long as it's geared towards offense, has rather stealth-oriented attributes, and lesser negative side effects, it would be fine by me." This was to boost his nightmare's control to its full extent. At times, he could control a target by himself while Palaz Zoroast controlled the mystical item, giving the dazed opponent a lethal strike. Once he became a spirit warlock, with a natural spirit or wraith or shadow sealed in his teeth to aid him, he could do 2 or even 3 things at a time. After Mr. Starr finished his explanation, Alger didn't harp over the details. He asked, "Roughly what level is needed?" "Somewhere around a grade 2 sealed artifact but slightly stronger. Corresponding to sequence 5 or 6. Leonard had habitually described the item using the parlance of an official beyonder before switching to more common terminology. At that instant, a thought flashed across the minds of Audrey, Cadlia, Alger, and Zio. Mr. Starr is an official beyonder, or at least he once was. From their point of view, although beyonders that didn't belong to any official organization would at times use the concept of grades when describing sealed artifacts, they wouldn't consider using such a vague description when precision was needed in expressing their thoughts and requests. One would often choose a method of explanation that was more direct and easier to understand. Therefore, the conclusion easily appeared. This way, things turned way more interesting. Mr. World is actually very familiar with an official beyonder. How did they get to know each other? Why would he rope in an official beyonder into the Tarot Club? Audrey didn't say a word as she maintained her state as a spectator while enjoying herself. At this moment, Alger tersely acknowledged. A mystical item at sequence 5 costs at least £9,000. For one that matches your request, it can typically exceed £12,000. Very frank. Leonard nodded. I understand. After hearing his reply, Klein nearly facepalmed as he sighed inwardly. Aren't you showing your hidden card to Mr. Hanged Man by doing so? I dare bet that if he has something suitable, the price will definitely be above £12,000. Aside from the £7,000 from Tinder, Leonard still actually has other savings. With the guidance of a grandpa from the Marauder pathway, he has likely amassed quite a bit. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to purchase Tinder. I get it. He's not afraid of being fleeced, because he still can purchase from the Hermits of Fate. He can compare the traits and prices from both sides. But the problem is that gathering happens once every half a year. It's totally not at the tarot gatherings pace. At this moment in time, Klein couldn't help but consider selling items to the dear poet that had repeated effects or were of little use after becoming a demigod. He then heard Mr. Hanged Man reply in a deep and calm manner, "All right. I'll keep an eye out for you." Okay. Cadlia and the other members expressed their stance as well. Following that, there weren't any transactions, allowing the gathering to automatically enter the free exchange segment. Without waiting for Mr. Hanged Man to inquire, Derek raised his hand and said, "I'm already back in the City of Silver. The chief has informed me that we will begin another round of preliminary explorations of the Giant King's court shortly. Does he mean that I should make use of this time to advance to become a priest of light? Giant King's court? Explorations of the Giant King's court?" Leonard cast his gaze to the pubescent youth 1 seat away from him in surprise. From what he knew, the Giant King's court had already been destroyed long ago in the Second Epoch. Pallas Zoroast, as an angel, had already said that it had vanished from the rivers of time. To his surprise, the son of the Tarot Club was about to explore the area, but none of the members were astonished. Yes, not one of them. Leonard subconsciously looked at Miss Judgment, who was also a newcomer, but he realized that she was apparently aware of this and had remained rather calm. This Miss Magician has privately kept Miss Judgment up to speed. Only Leonard doesn't know anything. The fool Klein leaned into his seat and seriously analyzed himself. After he pulled Leonard above the gray fog and assigned him the star card, he had ignored him. He didn't even write to him or introduce the Tarot Club's general situation to him. Compared to women, men truly aren't meticulous with the details. Klein was just about to control the world Gehrman to explain to the star Leonard when he saw the moon Emlyn glance at the poet beside him and say with a rather faint smile, "The Giant King's court is in the forsaken land of the gods." After saying that, he ignored Leonard's reaction, and he said to the son, "Have you obtained the ingredients to Priest of Light?" He knew that someone had only received the formula just 1 to 2 weeks ago. "Yes, I've gotten it from Mr. World," Derek answered honestly, but he didn't go into the details of the transaction. At this moment, Leonard's mind was filled with the words, "Forsaken Land of the Gods," and "Giant King's Court." He had a feeling like he had walked out of a fantasy or myth. He instinctively reassessed his knowledge of the Tarot Club, realizing the weight of the simple words of how the members come from different places. Even the churches of the 7 deities are unable to find the forsaken land of the gods, but the Tarot Club can do so. It has even roped in a member from there. Right, Isaac Eggers, who I believe wields the death card, doesn't appear at the gathering. Apart from the members here, there are others that come directly under Mr. Fool? It's as I first imagined. It's a secret organization that might develop into an Orthodox church. It's not much weaker than the Aurora Order or Rose School of Thought, and it might even be stronger in certain aspects. This is really a divine council. Amidst Leonard's thoughts, Alger agreed with Derek's guess. That's what it is. Exploring the Giant King's court is a very dangerous matter. He wishes that you quickly grow stronger to resist that elder shepherd's level. Derek nodded in vague acknowledgement. I get it. Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man. He then shared information about what he saw at Noise City, leaving Leonard and Xiao dumbfounded. They had no idea how such a strange state and atmosphere was generated. However, the fool Klein noticed something familiar. He felt that Noise City and the foggy town resembled each other to a certain degree. The walking crowd was suspected to be lifeless marionettes. Could it be that there's a higher sequence item of the seer pathway or some monster there? Klein didn't say a word as he silently took note of Noise City. At this moment, Xiao glanced at the world and said, showcasing some goodwill, MI9 has recently been investigating Gehrman Sparrow's origins. Chapter 960. The fool's sigh. Upon hearing the name, Gehrman Sparrow, all the members on both sides of the long bronze table looked at the world. No one spoke or interjected. They more or less knew that the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, had once again done something huge such as killing Admiral Hell Ludwell. However, Audrey didn't believe that this was the main reason why he would suffer mental problems. And the way they acted made Leonard instantly realize a fact: everyone in the Tarot Club knew that the world was Gehrman Sparrow. Klein's disguise is really well done. However, why does he let the other members know of his identity as Gehrman Sparrow? Isn't it common sense to hide one's background at such gatherings? Amidst his puzzlement, Leonard heard the blurry-figured the world reply with a hoarse voice, "What clues has MI9 obtained?" Xiao showed no shame in betraying MI9 as she replied frankly, "They have confirmed that the identity Gehrman Sparrow is fabricated, and that it was sourced from Backlund. Indeed, he was previously known as Sherlock Moriarty. He became Gehrman Sparrow after leaving Backlund. However, Sherlock Moriarty isn't his real identity either." Leonard subconsciously surveyed the area and realized that, although the other members weren't surprised, they didn't seem to show any signs of realizing it. Hence, he believed that their knowledge of Klein was only at the uppermost surface. Under Klein's control, the world Gehrman Sparrow chuckled and answered, "Misjudgment's information, there's no need to bother about such matters." To him, to figure out who the fake identity of Gehrman Sparrow was given to, one had to first capture Queen Mystic Bernadette, or one had to obtain news of Sharon from her. Clearly, the level of difficulty made it nearly impossible. In comparison, if they did the same as Leonard, starting off from the events in which Detective Sherlock Moriarty was involved in, there was a chance of them figuring out more. However, since MI9 had chosen the wrong direction, Klein was happy to see them take the futile route. Mr. World is unperturbed and very confident. Xiao retracted her gaze and didn't continue. At this moment, Audrey deliberated and asked, "Mr. World, will you be returning to Backlund in the future? Will you still use the identity of Dwayne Dantes?" As a qualified psychiatrist, she obviously wasn't going to inform the mental problems of the world to the other members of the Tarot Club. She only wanted to confirm if he would still return to the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. That way, she could be in closer contact to him in the real world, allowing for a better checkup. She didn't conceal the matter about Dwayne Dantes, since the original members already knew of it. As for Mr. Star, he was clearly familiar with Mr. World. As for Xiao, she had furs to inform her ahead of time. Ah! Upon hearing Miss Justice's words, Leonard nearly couldn't believe his ears as he felt a little confused. Klein Moretti is equivalent to Dwayne Dantes? I've once asked Dwayne Dantes to his face about Klein Moretti. No, it's impossible. Dwayne Dantes is an undying creature who has lived since the Fourth Epoch. The way he acted is sufficient proof. Old Man said the same too. At that moment, Leonard was unable to control his tumultuous emotions. He instinctively rejected the fact that Miss Justice had conveyed. If what appeared here was his astral projection, he felt that his expressions would be rather obvious, oscillating between red and white. Opposite Leonard, Xiao looked up as well, looking at Mr. World with puzzlement. He's Dwayne Dantes. Dwayne Dantes is Gairman Sparrow? I even accepted his butler's mission. I even protected him before. I even pitted him. He can squash me to death with one hand. Xiao then turned her head and glared at Furs. I don't dare to say too much about Mr. World. I could only briefly mention a little. Furs turned her eyes away in guilt as she mumbled silently. Alger and Katlia figured out something from the duo's reactions. Miss Magician and Miss Judgment knew each other in the real world. Miss Judgment had once interacted with Dwayne Dantes before, but she didn't know that he was Gairman Sparrow. As a senior spectator, Audrey noticed the abnormalities of the Star and Judgment without a doubt. Immediately, she understood that she had made too many assumptions. Audrey, you need to reflect on this. She said to herself in embarrassment and attempted to make up for it before Mr. World spoke. Dwayne Dantes is a public identity. At times, it will be Mr. World, and at other times, it will be the other blessed of Mr. Fool. So that's how it is. Makes sense. Leonard's mind stirred as he instantly accepted Miss Justice's explanation and figured out many different matters. The Dwayne Dantes that appeared during the period before the breaching of St. Samuel Cathedral's Cheney's Gate was likely Klein. The periods before and after that was the other blessed of Mr. Fool. That death consul? Indeed, he's an undying creature who lived since the fourth epoch. Old man's old friend. Yes, it might be other blessed I'm not aware of, but their levels definitely aren't too low. Other blessed. Does that mean Klein is also considered Mr. Fool's blessed? It's no wonder Mr. Fool said that he comes here and participates in the gathering, but the experiences are different from mine. It's because he's a blessed and enjoys the benediction of Mr. Fool, so he also has the ancient aura. It's why old man doesn't realize that Dwayne Dantes is played by different people. This explains my previous question. As a blessed, Gairman Sparrow doesn't need to keep his identity a secret. But to Judgment Xiao, Dwayne Dantes being a public identity, or him being Gairman Sparrow was not her concern. The reason why she overreacted was because, after realizing the truth, she felt embarrassed at all her various thoughts back then. Seeing the atmosphere return to normal, Klein heaved a sigh of relief inwardly and controlled the world Gairman Sparrow to answer Miss Justice's question, yes. When the time comes, there might be certain matters that need all of your help. When he finished the second half of his sentence, the world swept his gaze across Justice, the Magician, Judgment, the Star, and the Moon. He has plans for something in Backlund? Audrey instantly understood what Mr. World was getting at. She momentarily felt excited but also a little worried. She was excited because she was about to participate in a secret operation that all the participants didn't seem to have any ties with, to the point of not even knowing each other. This was something she had always looked forward to. Her worry stemmed from whether the operation would have any threat to Backlund's safety, or if it would bring harm to the innocent. As for danger to herself, she wasn't too worried. She believed that Mr. World would arrange for the mission to be held in the outskirts of the city, provide key information, or cause serious misdirection to the target, without needing any direct participation or fighting. Emlyn was the second person to read between the lines. And this was a result of his innate aversion towards troublesome matters. Will it be troublesome? He thought with a frown without saying a word. While the other members came to a realization, Alger took a deep look at the world Gairman Sparrow and said, I recently received news that the traitor of the Church of Evernight, Archbishop Ince Zangwill, was killed in West Balam. Before that, he had already become a demigod. As for the sealed artifact, 0-08, which he had stolen, it's unknown whose hands it's in. The only thing that can be certain is that the battlefield was cleared by the Church of Evernight. The Hanged Man is very updated on the news. It's only been a few days. The church should have kept this strictly confidential. However, there might have been other factions arriving at the square that day. Leonard was taken aback for a moment, but he didn't provide more information. This was the first time Audrey and company were learning about the news. They could only determine that the matter was rather important from the words Archbishop, 0-08, and demigod. But since it had nothing to do with them and there wasn't any stimulus, they weren't too intrigued. As for Katlia, as she had a deep impression and understanding of Grade O sealed artifacts, she planned on seeking out information on this via Queen Mystic and the Moses Ascetic Order after she returned to the real world. Amidst a brief silence, the Fool Klein suddenly extended his hand and rapped the table's surface. He felt that he needed to warn all the members. In the coming years, the waves of the times would come flooding in. Upon hearing that, all the members straightened their backs or made them even straighter before turning to the seat of honor at the long bronze table. Even the newly joined Leonard and Zio were no exception. It was almost instinctive. Then, they heard the profound and lofty figure chuckle amidst the gray fog. The times have changed as a result. The times have changed because of this? Zangwill's matter is key to something? Although it involves a Grade O sealed artifact. Alger, who had shared the news, never expected Mr. Fool to place so much emphasis on it. He was momentarily unsure what to make out of it. Leonard, who had participated in the matter regarding Zangwill, felt the same. He knew how important and terrifying the Grade O sealed artifact was, but he never expected that what happened that day would change the times. While Audrey and company wore blank looks, they focused fully. Even Derek couldn't help but take on an attentive posture. The Fool Klein surveyed the area and said with a laugh and sigh, "Adam is one step closer to being divine." Chapter 961 Warning by informing, Adam is one step closer to being divine. Such a simple sentence instantly sent tumultuous waves through every member of the Tarot Club. Other than Leonard, the other members, including Zio, who had been briefed of the important points by the magician, immediately recalled the information regarding Adam. Ancient sun god, City of Silver's creator's son, brother of blasphemer Ammon. Suspected to be one of the 8 kings of angels. And this mythical figure, who had existed before the cataclysm, had become active in the real world once again. And he was one step closer to being divine. This. To make Mr. Fool sigh, it means that Adam is probably just one step short of reaching the divine throne, sequence 0. There's a chance that he might make that step at any moment. Alger subconsciously came to a conclusion as he hurriedly clasped his hands and couldn't help but have thoughts run through his mind. A sequence O true God is about to be born. There are still births of true gods in the 5th epoch. This will be the first true god this epoch. With deities no longer able to descend upon the real world, it's unbelievable that a sequence O would still appear. Alger always found himself ambitious, with him now setting his sights on sequence 2, to become an angel. But after hearing about Adam, he still found it unacceptable. One had to know that the last one to become a sequence O true god was the former god of craftsmanship, the present god of steam and machinery. And that happened in the late 4th epoch. Since the 5th epoch, over 1300 years, there hadn't been any new existence reaching the divine throne. It's no wonder Mr. Fool said that the times will change as a result. Amidst Katlia's scattered thoughts, she suddenly came to a realization as though she could see the waves that marked the end of an epoch flooding over. Having already gathered the ingredients and being in the process of making preparations for the sequence 4 ritual, she believed she had the chance of attaining divinity in the near future to change her existence. She was still reeling in joy, anticipation, and unease. But at this moment, she suddenly felt a baffling sense of horror. All she wanted was to communicate with Queen Mystic face to face to confirm the future. Furs, Zio, and the other members had a myriad of reactions. On the one hand, they were shocked that Adam was attempting to achieve divinity, never expecting such a matter to happen in the 5th epoch. On the other hand, they were worried for their present life. After all, be it Emlyn from the Sanguine, or Audrey who lived amongst the Lone Kingdom's upper class, all of them lived in the fifth epoch, living in a situation which had more than 1,000 years of history setting the foundation. They didn't dare have any sacrilegious thoughts towards true gods. Even when facing evil gods like the true Creator, they still felt a deep sense of fear and awe, acknowledging their level and loftiness. Therefore, they couldn't believe that a god would soon appear. They couldn't imagine what would happen next. In their eyes, the fool was a reawakened ancient god, an existence who originally sat at the throne of Sequence O. One step closer to being divine. Becoming a god. Derek was mostly excited, as though he could see hope and have a target to strive for. To him, only a Sequence O could save the City of Silver. Adam? Becoming a god. Although Leonard didn't know who Adam was, just the simple words of being one step closer to being divine was easy to understand. He connected it to that ordinary priest who had appeared after the battle ended and had picked up 0-08 in front of Klein. That's Adam? Or a subordinate of Adam? No, 0-08 is a grade O sealed artifact. Only Adam, who's very close to the divine throne, can do it personally with great certainty. It's no wonder the battle with Zangwill was easier than I expected. I thought the best outcome would be me and Klein dragging Zangwill into hell together. Who's Adam? Why haven't I heard of him? Perhaps a result of being parasitized by an angel, allowing him to know some of the secrets and developments of the fourth epoch, Leonard had a deeper understanding of Adam's path to being divine. The impact he felt wasn't too great, with most of his feelings puzzlement and curiosity over Adam's true identity. And at this moment, the fool didn't speak again or give further explanations. It was as though he was simply warning the members to make preparations for the change of the times. Amidst the confusion and wandering thoughts, the world Gehrman Sparrow glanced at the star Leonard and simply said, Adam is the son of the ancient sun god, blasphemer Amon's brother. Leonard immediately jumped in fright and failed to control his expression. He had a deep impression of Amon, and he had a deep trauma for Amon because of Old Man's descriptions. And Adam was Amon's brother, so it was very possible that the level of horror was likely the same between the two brothers. The world ignored the star's reaction and continued, it can be confirmed now that Adam is one of the 8 kings of angels, titled Angel of Imagination. He is ranked on par with Angel of Time Amon. The reason for him targeting Zangwill is to obtain 0-08 to make up any shortfalls for his path to being divine. And his plan succeeded. Angel of Imagination. Adam is a king of angels from the spectator pathway? Audrey instantly connected this to the Dragon King Anquelt's title, Dragon of Imagination. And she had long known that mind dragons represented the spectator pathway. As for Leonard, another comprehension obstacle appeared before him. He had been stumped by the concept of a king of angels, but he was too embarrassed to ask. He had planned on seeking Old Man's help when he awakened. Alger pondered over Gehrman Sparrow's words as his expression turned slightly odd. He probed, You seem to have witnessed the matter? Just as he said that, all of them heard a familiar, hoarse laughter. After Gehrman Sparrow finished laughing, he looked at the star and said as though it was nothing, the murder of Zangwill was committed by me and my partner. Cadlia's mind instantly went blank. She could accept that Gehrman Sparrow could easily finish off Admiral Hell, but she couldn't imagine that he would one day kill a real Sequence for demigod. Cadlia quickly calmed down because, with a king of angels involved in the battle, it was possible that a Sequence 5 could kill off a heavily injured demigod due to various coincidences. Furthermore, he had a partner. Audrey read confidence from the world's tone. She couldn't help but ask out of curiosity, Mr. World, have you already become a demigod? The world didn't give a direct answer as he chuckled. In the future, all of you can entrust matters involving demigods to me. Every member present figured out the meaning in between the lines. He had become a genuine Sequence for demigod. Furthermore, he was the kind who had the ability to kill peers at his level. At that instant, Katlia became abnormally calm. She tried hard to recall everything that she had seen and heard regarding Gehrman Sparrow. She was very certain that he was only a sequence 6 before the visit to the ruins of the battlefield of gods. He relied on the glove to match a sequence 5. As for Gehrman Sparrow's search for mermaids without hunting any of them, it implied that it was a requirement of a ritual. This meant that he had indeed advanced to sequence 5 back then. His various performances after that proved this point. Today, it had only been about 3 months since Gehrman Sparrow stepped into the ruins of the battlefield of the gods, but he had already advanced to sequence 4, becoming a demigod existence. This overturned Katlia's understanding of the world. She wasn't too old, with her age being less than 30. But to reach sequence 5 and gain the title of Admiral of Stars, it took her about 7 to 8 years. It was only in the past 1 or 2 years did she have the confidence to attempt to breach the gate to become a demigod. With her starting to make preparations, she believed she was already far ahead of the pack. Mr. World is impressive. He became a demigod so quickly. Derek sincerely felt joy. His idolization for Mr. World grew more intense as he hoped that he could be like him, becoming a demigod at the fastest speed possible. Audrey was both alarmed and delighted. Following that, she gained an understanding towards the abnormality in Gehrman Sparrow's mental state. From the looks of it, his low spirits, gloomy, and depressed feelings happened after he became a demigod. These are the negative effects accumulated from potions. It's just like how I nearly lost control when I became a psychiatrist. Also, after becoming a sequence 4 and gaining godhood, he could naturally penetrate more of reality. He then realized that he had been sleeping for a very long time. His family had passed away, making him lose his goals. How pitiful. With his warm nature, he must have had deep feelings for his family and friends. However, I'm so envious. Does being Mr. Fool's blessed make one advance so quickly? I also wish to become a demigod early. Mr. Fool's mention that the times have changed as a result leaves me fretting. While Emlyn and the other members were still in shock, Alger, who also shared the same feelings and felt deep envy and jealousy towards Gehrman Sparrow, had other thoughts. As Mr. Fool's blessed, Gehrman Sparrow's embroilment with this king of angels and 0-08 matter clearly isn't an accident. On the contrary, it might be more reasonable that it's a mutual plan between Angel of Imagination Adam and Mr. Fool. That will explain it. 2 mythical figures that existed before the cataclysm. One is awakening, and the other is making an advancement, the two secretly coming together. Amidst his thoughts, Alger had another idea. Since Adam had obtained 0-08 and opened the door to the divine throne, what about Mr. Fool? What benefit did he get in this matter? Subconsciously, Alger turned his body and slightly bowed his head to look at the seat of honor. He didn't dare look directly, and could only look through the corner of his eye. Chapter 962. Being known almost instantly, Alger discovered that Mr. Fool was somewhat different than before. In the past, although Mr. Fool was distant and profound, making him appear unfathomable, as though he was looking down upon everything from above, that was all. It wasn't like he was now. Even though he wasn't doing anything, he seemed to have fused with the entire space, a clear expression of him being the ruler at the pinnacle level. Sweeping his gaze, Alger saw the 3rd card of blasphemy as he felt more certain of his guess. Indeed, Mr. Fool and the Angel of Imagination Adam had cooperated to machinate in Zengwil's demise. One of them obtained 0-08, making him take one step closer to being a god, while the other obtained the various benefits in a card of blasphemy and regained a substantial amount of his strength. The times will change as a result. At that instant, Alger had a deeper understanding of what Mr. Fool had just said. The other members undoubtedly noticed him turning his head, and they realized that he was looking at Mr. Fool. After a brief moment of surprise, they made a certain realization at different speeds. Mr. Fool was aware of Angel of Imagination Adam's plot against Zangwill from the very beginning and had sent his blessed to cooperate. He had even provided a certain level of help. If that weren't the case, how could a recently advanced demigod participate in a matter that involved a king of angels and grade O sealed artifact? If this weren't the case, the world wouldn't have been able to understand the situation that well, even if he had been embroiled due to all kinds of coincidences. The obtaining of the card of blasphemy, Mr. World's advancement, Zangwill's death, the meeting of Angel of Imagination Adam's goal, these all happened in 1 week. This means that the relationship between them is tightly intertwined. My previous intuition was right. The obtaining of a new card of blasphemy and the appearance of an abnormality in Mr. World's mental state were the different outcomes of the same matter. Audrey nodded very slightly as she confirmed her theory. Leonard was increasingly convinced that Zangwill's matter was more complicated than he had imagined. Apart from King of Angels Adam, there were likely other important figures of similar levels appearing back then. Otherwise, Amon's brother, the son of the ancient sun god, had no need to seek out Mr. Fool's help. After all, no matter how powerful or terrifying 0-08 was, it was incapable of comparing with the blasphemer as described by Old Man, as Adam and Amon were likely on par with each other. The evil spirit that Klein pulled into the underworld probably isn't simple. It's definitely not something that, being from the hunter pathway, would be enough to describe it with. Klein's participation in the matter regarding Zangwill isn't solely for revenge, but is also due to Mr. Fool's orders. As Leonard sighed, he didn't generate any negative feelings. Instead, he was secretly relieved. From his point of view, this was a very ordinary situation. Mr. Fool's agreement in convening such a gathering to establish a corresponding organization while hosting it as a deity was definitely not because he solely wished to make the area more lively or being done out of goodwill. He definitely had his goals and needs that he wished blessed like Klein or members like him could complete. Therefore, seeking revenge on Zangwill and accepting Mr. Fool's mission wasn't in conflict. The latter didn't reduce the former's meaning and importance. As for why he was relieved, it was because Leonard believed that Mr. Fool's clear expression of his goals had made it better than having everything chaotic and unknown. He didn't need to guess or wait with trepidation. He originally had intense wariness for Palaz Zoroast precisely because he wasn't sure of his true motives. At this moment, the fool Klein didn't say a word. He didn't confirm or deny the members' guesses and theories. Controlling the world, he made him continue. Adam might have established a very secretive organization, and it has been secretly steering the development of the times. Many important figures you might never have expected are members of this organization. They would machinate one matter after another. Also, after leaving this place, do not say or write down Adam's name, including his title. Try not to think about such matters, because he has the trait of any mention of it will be known. The more you know about him, the more he might know about you. This is somewhat similar to 0-08. After hearing Mr. World's description, Audrey instantly recalled learning of the mysterious organization from Mr. Fool, the Twilight Hermit Order. This made her quickly come up with a corresponding theory. The King of Angels Adam was the leader of the Twilight Hermit Order. The Angel of Imagination was a member of the Spectator Pathway. Likewise for 0-08. Therefore, any mention of it will be known was a beyonder power of this pathway at higher sequences. Likewise for, the more you know of it, the more it knows of you. Impressive. But won't this be rather noisy? Audrey momentarily looked forward to it with envy while also feeling worried and puzzled. Any mention of it will be known. So the organization behind the assassination of Duke Negan, the one backer behind Kalangos, was established by King of Angels Adam. Alger was first somewhat enlightened before his expression fell. He began to suspect that the primitive island that he had previously explored was related to this secret organization. This was because Kalangos had once ventured deep into it and discovered several items. Furthermore, the final disappearance of the island had resembled the powers of the Dragon of Imagination as described by the Sun. Putting the two together, Alger couldn't help but come up with such a theory as he made a deeper realization that Mr. Fool's cooperation with the Angel of Imagination had started when he and Gehrman Sparrow stepped into that primitive island. He was more convinced that it was the truth because after the existence in that island's ruin awakened, the only thing that happened was a sigh. He and Gehrman Sparrow weren't stopped from leaving. So that's how it is. The way important figures set up their ploys are truly well concealed. I didn't notice it at all back then. The games between gods are truly complicated. Perhaps only Sequence 1 Beyonders or even King of Angels are qualified to participate. Alger sighed as he felt a baffling sense of desire. Furs had already forgotten the mysterious organization which Mr. Fool had mentioned previously. Only when she heard any mention of it will be known, did she recall that it was related to Duke Negan's assassination. However, she wasn't concerned about this problem but something else. Back when she was informing Zio about the general situation of the Tarot Club and the general knowledge, she had mentioned Adam's name. Adam has the trait of any mention will be known? This. Zio and I are known by him. Furs instantly felt horrified as she couldn't help but turn her head and cast her gaze to Zio. She had learned that Adam was the son of the Creator from Mam Hermit. Furthermore, she had never emphasized to not mention the King of Angels' name in the outside world. Ivy mentioned Adam in the real world, Furs said with a clear stammer. Zio's nerves were taut as though a venomous snake had crawled into her clothes and was sliding across her back. Katlia tersely acknowledged. No need to worry. Although not many people know of Adam and Amon, there's no lack of them. I've mentioned his name on several occasions. As long as the words you mention doesn't involve any secrets, I believe he will only observe you for a moment before casting his gaze elsewhere. She was rather certain when saying that because, in the Moses ascetic order that had been pursued by knowledge, Adam's existence wasn't a secret. People often mentioned him. At this moment, her mind was filled with another matter. Could it be that the secret, ancient organization that Emperor Roselle joined was the one that King of Angels Adam established? Furs hurriedly tried recalling and said somewhat hesitantly, there were mentions involving the forsaken land of the gods, the giant king's court, Amon, King of Angels, and other knowledge. Would that be a problem? She was very happy that she had never mentioned the words, Tarot Club or described the other members. At most, she mentioned that the gloomiest was Gehrman Sparrow. Katlia thought and said, at your sequence, discussing knowledge at that level is indeed strange. However, if Adam were to delve deeper, he will realize that you're related to the Abraham family. It's quite normal to be aware of this information. What you need to pay attention to is that any major matters involving the Abraham family will require you to be wary of Adam. How do I be wary of him? Furs forced a helpless smile as she glanced at the seat of honor at the long bronze table. Then, she looked back at the hermit and said, thank you for your analysis. As Mr. Fool hadn't said anything, she decided to believe Mam Hermit's words. At this moment, Klein sighed inwardly. Back when Katlia mentioned Adam during the tarot gathering, he wasn't aware that Adam's name wasn't to be verbalized, nor did he know that he was related to the Twilight Hermit Order. It was only when he entered Groselle's travels and learned from ascetic Snowman about Adam being the Angel of Imagination that he grasped this point and came up with the theory. After seeing Mr. Door's warning from Emperor Roselle's diary and gained preliminary confirmation, he ultimately lacked the opportunity to warn the various members. Furthermore, the way the Archbishop of the Church of Steam casually mentioned Adam's name made him believe that many people in the real world knew of Adam and that it wasn't taboo. Furthermore, Adam might not be his full name. He wasn't in a rush to guide the conversation towards this, but he was waiting for an opportunity. Any mention of it will be known? The organization established by Adam is really impressive. Is this the target our tarot club is aiming at? As Emlyn reflected over it poignantly, he gained a clear picture of the Tarot Club. He had previously been figuring out a category for the Tarot Club. He realized that it wasn't like an Orthodox church, and it was unlike the other secret organizations. Apart from being a Messiah alliance, there wasn't anything too special. It muddled his analysis. And today, he finally confirmed that the early development of the Tarot Club could match Adam's organization. Knowing 0-08's trait, Leonard wasn't surprised that Adam had a similar trait. He was more concerned about the organization with many important figures participating, as well as the Abraham family which Mam Hermit had mentioned. He had once heard Pallas Zoroast mention, this family's standing in the fourth epoch was very high. Chapter 963 Problem with Intelligence. According to what Leonard knew, amongst the major noble families of the Fourth Epoch's Tudor Empire, the Abraham family was ranked first. It was even stronger than the Amon family who had the blasphemer. Of course, he couldn't be certain if the Amon family didn't have any members, that it was all filled with the Son of God's avatars. Miss Magician is actually an important member of the Abraham family. Everyone here isn't to be trifled with. Is this what's called a gathering of protagonists? Leonard first sighed before he made a self-deprecating comment. Derek didn't say a word, nor did he make any connections. He seriously listened to Mr. World's description, as well as the conversation between the two ladies, the magician and the hermit, before keeping them to heart. To him, the other members were in the outside world. Regardless of what happened, it had little to do with him or the City of Silver. Only matters regarding the King of Angels was something to be concerned about. After all, be it the Angel of Fate Ouroboros, the Dark Angel Sasra, and Red Angel Medici, they had left traces around the City of Silver. As for the Angel of Time, Amon, he had personally visited it before, bringing about inexplicable horror. After everyone quietened down, Derek couldn't help but consider certain matters. Any mention of it will be known. How should I inform the chief about such matters? Or is it fine not saying it for the time being? I'll just mention that Amon is a son of the Creator, that he has another brother who's of the same pathway as the Dragon of Imagination. If the City of Silver were to encounter an overwhelming disaster, would Adam be able to hear it if I said his name? Can he enter the forsaken land of the gods? With this in mind, Derek instantly felt somewhat ashamed. This was because, in such situations, the honorific name he should chant was Mr. Fools. At this moment, the world spoke again. Although War Angel Medici has long perished, he isn't completely dead. The soul he left behind has fused with the souls of the ancestors of the two major families of Sauron and Einhorn, forming an evil spirit. During the death of Ince Zangwill, there were traces of its appearance. Klein had specially brought up this point to firstly pass this information to the Church of Evernight via Leonard. Secondly, it was to remind the hanged man to take note. After all, he had been to Bansi twice, possibly embroiling himself with the Red Angel evil spirit's fate. That evil spirit was War Angel Medici. While Leonard was feeling alarmed, he was taken aback. He had just guessed that Adam wasn't the only bigwig who had been present. Later, setting off from the titles of War Angel and Angel of Imagination, he suspected that the evil spirit was a king of angels in its former life. And such an evil spirit had been sent to the underworld without putting up any resistance under the influence of the luck siphon charm. Old man's level is higher than I previously imagined. Yes, the evil spirit must have been weakened by Adam, and perhaps even by Mr. Fool, before Ma'am Daly and I arrived. Otherwise, it's not an enemy we could have handled. Right, what was Adam doing back then? There wasn't any sign of him during the entire battle. Could it be that there was another figure at the level of a king of angels holding back Adam? Leonard felt tumultuous waves swishing through his heart as he forgot to observe the reactions of the other members. War Angel Medici. He perished and became an evil spirit. Bansi was the place his descendants lived. He was one of the founders of Rose Redemption. Alger quickly linked up the pieces of information and learned many new things. That mural I saw in the Bansi Harbor telegraph office must have been drawn by that evil spirit. The World Gehrman Sparrow had gotten me to head to Bansi Harbor to search for traces in order to grasp that terrifying evil spirit's location. It was to prevent his subsequent plans from being disrupted. Thankfully, I didn't destroy that mural. Otherwise, I might have caught the notice of the evil spirit. While Alger sighed in relief, he felt increasingly alert. He planned on getting the Blue Avenger to leave Bansi Harbor and head for the northern front of the Sonia Sea to investigate the matter Mr. Fool had previously given him. Audrey, Katlia, and the other members listened attentively as they kept it in mind without making too many connections. This was because the matter the world was describing contained information that mostly consisted of key and rich points. And lacking the additional experiences and knowledge, they were unable to expand on the matter. After sharing the information that everyone needed to take note of, the world chuckled hoarsely. That's about it. After a brief silence, Emlyn straightened his back and looked ahead. An important figure from my kind will arrive in Backlund, and a meeting with me has been arranged. After a pause, and seeing how no one responded, he cleared his throat and asked, "How should I deal with him?" Him. Another angel. Leonard felt numb as he noticed something. Mr. Moon had mentioned the concept of his kind, and he had red eyes. Leonard was taken aback as he thought to himself, he's a sanguine. Sanguine. Don't tell me he's Emlyn White from the Harvest Church? He had been close to Klein's identity as a detective. Leonard couldn't help but look at the Moon's side profile and figure a few more times. The more Leonard looked at him, the more familiar he appeared. He was almost certain. Without any doubts, Emlyn noticed the Star sizing him up, just as Audrey was surprised and excited to confirm that Mr. Star had suddenly realized he knew Mr. Moon. Did I say something wrong? That fellow, the Star, looked somewhat astonished. He knows me in the real world? Do I know him? A series of thoughts flashed through Emlyn's mind as he subconsciously sniffed, trying to catch the scent of the new member beside him. However, the gray fog ensured that he failed. As he surveyed the area and waited for the Hanged Man, the Hermit, and the world to provide him with an analysis and suggestion, he tried hard to recall if he had met someone like the Star. Gradually, he felt a sense of familiarity, but he couldn't recall who it was due to the superficial impression the person left on him. At this point, Audrey recalled another problem. Mr. World and Mr. Star know each other, and Mr. Star knows Mr. Moon. Then, does Mr. World know Mr. Moon? She subconsciously sized up the person at the lower end of the long bronze table, but she failed to read anything of use from the World Gehrman Sparrow. As for Alger, he turned to look at the Moon after a few seconds of thought. He said with some deliberation, "Mr. Fool just mentioned that the times are changing. Although the important members of the Sanguine might not know of the ins and outs, at their level, they will more or less sense something and make preparations. The reason that this important figure wishes to meet you is both a probing action and surveillance. You just need to act as you usually do, but there will subsequently be some tests and missions. As I imagined. A second test and mission will begin. I wonder what revelation the ancestor has given." Emlyn nodded and said to the Hanged Man, "Thank you." With the question answered, Furs, who had been holding back all this while, finally spoke. "Mr. Moon, the intelligence you gave me regarding the abandoned ancient castle was highly problematic. There were 2 ancient wraiths, but in the underground area was a door. Sealed behind the door is a powerful corruptive power. As long as one enters the region where the ancient wraiths are, they will be corrupted. This." Emlyn frowned slightly. He wasn't enraged, and he instead felt that her description was completely right. If the person who had provided the intelligence knew that there were 2 ancient wraiths, he wouldn't have ignored that door. As a cultured and noble sanguine, Emlyn never wished for anyone to incur any losses or harm because of his mistakes or neglect. He was rather perturbed by this as he thought and solemnly said, I will investigate the source and provide you with an answer. As Furs had returned safely, she didn't mind it too much. She tersely answered, indicating that she was awaiting the outcome. As for being saved by Mr. Fool, with it happening once a month or even twice a month, she had already lost count. She was prepared to do anything Mr. Fool instructed her to do in the future. After they finished their conversation, Audrey was somewhat concerned. She asked out of curiosity, "Do you know what brought about that corruptive force?" Furs shook her head. "I don't know." With Mr. Fool not sharing any information, and how she didn't have any Roselle diary entries to exchange for the answer to the card of blasphemy, Audrey retracted her gaze and attentively listened to the conversation of the other members. After a while, the learning segment came to an end as the Tarot Club drew to a close. The members stood up and bowed at the existence at the end of the long bronze table to bid him farewell. This time, Leonard didn't appear too slow. The dark red light dissipated as he returned to the real world. In front of him was a red glove he hadn't worn. At this moment, a slightly aged voice suddenly sounded in his mind. "Whose dream did you enter a moment ago?" "Old man has woken up." Leonard was first delighted before he heaved a sigh of relief. He didn't immediately answer Pallas Zoroast as he deliberated over an answer. Say, it is possible that, at certain times, Dwayne Dantes is Isaac Eggers who's disguised using some particular item? After learning that Dwayne Dantes was a shared identity, he began doubting Old Man's original theory. This was because this parasite had came to a conclusion based on the different appearances and auras of Isaac Eggers and Dwayne Dantes. Furthermore, not every one of Mr. Fool's blessed looked identical to Dwayne Dantes, nor were every one of them beyonders of the seer pathway. Therefore, since a shared identity was needed, it meant that they wielded a mystical item or sealed artifact that allowed them to transform into someone else. Together with the ancient aura of being a blessed causing some interference, it wasn't impossible for an angel to make an error in judgment. Pallas Zoroast fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "You reminded me. Isaac Eggers does have a mask that allows him to transform into anyone." Chapter 964 Medici's cause of death as expected. After confirming his hypothesis, Leonard didn't harp on the matter as he returned to the topic at hand. "Old man, didn't you ask whose dream I entered?" "Yes, on the day we sought revenge against Zangwil, Amon's brother and a king of angels appeared." In his mind, the slightly aged voice didn't immediately reply. After a few seconds, there was a sigh. "It's just as I expected. Matters related to 0-08 will often attract Adam. Thankfully, I chose to sleep ahead of time." Leonard didn't have the time to ponder over Pallas Zoroast's words as he instinctively cried out, "Old man, why you said his name." Adam's gaze was about to be cast over, or might have already landed on them. The slightly aged voice chuckled. "You actually know about Adam's trait. However, me mentioning him doesn't matter. He will only imagine that someone else is talking about him. Of course, there's no need for you to know too much. That will definitely make you occasionally think of it. Once that happens too frequently or at a close physical distance, Adam will also know of it, just like 0-08. Furthermore, 0-08's influence is limited to a huge city, while Adam's is the entire world. As horrifying as Amon. Another form of horror. Leonard composed himself and forced himself to stop thinking about Adam as he ruminated over what Pallas Zoroast had said. Suddenly, he nearly blurted out without suppressing his voice, "Old man, did you sleep not because you were weak, but because you were afraid of encountering Amon's brother?" Ahem. Pallas cleared his throat. It was a result of both reasons, but they don't contradict one another. After giving you the 2 worms of time, my condition deteriorated again. Under such circumstances, how am I to deal with a king of angels and conceal my existence? I'm already old and feeble. There's no need for such developments, so it's almost necessary for me to hide. Leonard was momentarily at a loss for words and said after a few seconds, Amon and his brother should be older than you. The ancient sun god is an ancient god before the cataclysm. Without waiting for Pallas Zorost's reply, he heaved a sigh of relief. That is to say that, because of your act of sealing yourself and sleeping, that king of angels didn't discover a problem with me? Pallas chuckled. No, it was discovered. Leonard's expression sank as he nearly looked around frantically. He suspected that Adam was sitting in some corner, silently listening to his conversation with Old Man. At this moment, Pallas Zoroast added, you were very close to him. Do you think you can hide from a king of angels who has accommodated the spectator pathway's uniqueness? Besides, you likely cried out, Old Man, impolitely at the most critical moment. Leonard was taken aback as he subconsciously answered, why you heard it? He suspected that Old Man had heard him but had deliberately chosen to ignore him for fear of being discovered by Adam. No. Pallas' slightly aged voice teased, I don't have to hear it to know what you would do. How can I not be aware of what kind of person you are? Amidst Leonard's embarrassment, Pallas Zoroast continued, Adam definitely knows that you've been parasitized, but as I'd sealed myself and was asleep, he didn't discover who was parasitizing you. The demigods with such abilities aren't many, but it's also not a very tiny number. Is that so? Leonard instantly heaved a sigh of relief. He was most worried about having Adam see Old Man before returning to inform blasphemer Amon. With this in mind, Leonard raised a question he had been wondering all this while, Old Man, what's a king of angels? Pallas Zoroast didn't ask where Leonard had learned of this concept as, he simply explained, those that exceed sequence 1 but have yet to become a deity. If we are specifically talking about the 8 kings of angels, apart from those that meet the previous definition, they're the ones who served the ancient sun god before the cataclysm. What does it mean to exceed sequence 1 but have yet to become a deity? How is that achieved? By accommodating the so-called uniqueness? Leonard had the intention of asking, but he suspected that Old Man wouldn't answer in detail. He gradually decided to first talk about other matters before finding an opportunity to raise this issue again. He deliberated for a moment and said with a suppressed voice, during the battle for revenge with Zangwil, I faced immense adversity, to the point of not being able to look at my enemy head-on, much less use the luck siphon charm. When seeking your help failed, I chose to chant Mr. Fool's honorific name and had received a response. After everything ended, I found myself heading for an ancient palace as though I was dreaming. It was above the boundless grey fog. Before Leonard finished his description, Pallas, who had been listening quietly, cut him off. You met the fool? Yes, his aura is vastly deeper than the sea, loftier than the mountains. His figure was cloaked in the grey fog, preventing anyone from seeing it clearly. Leonard recalled his encounter and described in a poetic manner. He established an organization, holding a divine council a true one every Monday afternoon. I'm already one of the members. Pallas fell silent once again and didn't say a word for quite some time. Only after a while did he say, the fool allowed you to tell me this? Yes. Sitting there, Leonard nodded and let out a suppressed voice into the air as he said, Old Man, do you know him? Pallas Zoroast sighed and said, no, but I can roughly guess of his origins. You don't have to ask what it is because I won't tell you. This might be an opportunity for you. Otherwise, it will be difficult for you to become a demigod. Leonard turned agape before closing his mouth. He stopped mentioning the tarot gathering because Mr. Fool hadn't given him permission to go into the details of other matters. He thought and said, Old Man, is there another king of angels named Medici, known as the War Angel? Pallas tersely acknowledged, you can also address him as Red Angel. However, he has long perished. You were even close to where he died. Where? Leonard was surprised, but he had no impression of that happening. Pallas scoffed. Are the memories of you people from the Evernight pathway so terrible? I recall that your goddess wasn't like that. Do you still remember the ruin found beneath Backlund? The Tudor Trunsoist United Empire? The place where Alista Tudor became Blood Emperor? Leonard asked in enlightenment. Pallas Zorost's slightly aged voice resounded once again, that's right. As Leonard tried to figure out the logic embedded in this matter, he informed Old Man of the evil spirit. The remnant soul of Medici fused with the two angels of the Sauron and Einhorn family, becoming a brand new evil spirit? Pallas repeated Leonard's words in disbelief. Following that, he couldn't hide his amusement and said, the three of them are absolute archenemies, the kind that can't stand each other's existence. To think that they are together in death, fused as one, is truly, it must be quite lively. Leonard didn't know what Old Man was laughing about as he subconsciously asked, they are archenemies? Pallas held back his laughter as he said, yes, the reason why Medici failed and was captured was because he was dealing with the Sauron ancestor who had fallen into his trap. It wasn't that he wasn't prepared, but that was mainly focused on the primordial demoness side. Surprisingly, Alista Tudor suddenly went mad. On this matter, Amon and Adam had played a rather important role. That evil spirit is an enemy of Adam. Why would the Blood Emperor want to capture Medici and the two angels of Sauron and Einhorn? The place they perished was in the palace where Alista Tudor was trying to become Blood Emperor. They were the ritual materials needed to become a true god? According to Mr. Fool, Adam is one step closer to divinity after obtaining 0-08. Is this also considered a gathering of materials? Amon is dealing with Old Man because of similar reasons? Leonard had some theories and had the urge to ask, but he ultimately held back. He was afraid that he touched on highly secretive matters, causing Old Man to react negatively. He planned on finding an opportunity at the Tarot Club to ask about such matters. After a brief silence, Leonard looked at the closed door and said with a suppressed voice, has Mr. Fool and the Church reached a certain degree of tacit cooperation? That's the implication if no one is investigating you, Pallas Zorost answered in a rather direct manner. Leonard nodded indiscernibly. What will they arrange me to do next? Arrangement? Reward you for the services rendered and allow you to advance to sequence 5 after you finished digesting the potion. Then, you will be allocated a Red Gloves team, and you'll be sent to complete missions. Otherwise, they might send you to a large diocese like Backlund to be a deacon in charge of certain matters, Pallas said without much concern. Back to Backlund. Klein seems to be planning something in Backlund. Leonard's thoughts were suddenly liberated. He didn't converse with Old Man again as he slumped against the wall and cradled his head with his hands, sitting rather leisurely. Late at night, in the border town of East and West Balam, outside a row of warehouses. Dressed in a formal suit, Dwayne Dantes, with his white sideburns, was holding a gold-inlaid cane. After exchanging signals and countersigns with the officer on duty, he watched as the officer opened the door to the warehouse and heard him say in a relaxed manner, "It's everything inside. Check the goods and move it yourself. Also, pay me the remaining amount before leaving." Dwayne Dantes nodded slightly and weighed the suitcase in hand. In it was £5,000 in cash entirely from Maysanchez's down payment. At this moment, two figures were silently watching this develop 2 warehouses away in a 3-story building. Chapter 965 Brief crisis on the top floor of a small building, a black-haired, brown-eyed man donning dark-colored clothes was looking down at the arms deal not far away. This man who looked about 28 couldn't help but say, he actually got Maysanchez. Oh, Holy Lord of Storms, Alfred, if I had known it would turn out this way, we might as well have done the mission ourselves. Even if all the expenses are deducted, we should still earn at least £20,000. The man beside him was a young man in a black trench coat. He looked about 24 and had a head of resplendent blonde hair and blue eyes that resembled a lake. He had pretty good looks. Being addressed as Alfred, he shook his head and said, "No, that would be too noticeable. Sanchez's allegiance has always been unclear." Before figuring out his take on matters, rashly discussing an arms deal with him is extremely dangerous. Dwayne Dantes is able to earn £20,000 because he dares to take the risk. The black-haired and brown-eyed man immediately scoffed. To think that Alfred Hall, who has led a few dozen men to assault a battalion with over 1,000 troops, would claim that he doesn't dare take risks. Alfred shot a glance at him and said, "Pagani, this isn't the same thing. That happened because I was confident of wiping out their command center. And once there's a lack of leadership, 1,000 scattered troops might not be as formidable as 1,000 pigs. In addition, the transaction this time is solely a test. It's to establish communications and to set up a channel. If it's done by us, who are we to seek out the next time? And the subsequent ones? If we keep at it, we will ultimately expose ourselves. Once that happens, it will be a diplomatic matter. Furthermore, with the deals deepening and broadening, who knows if this would incur the notice of the demigods of other factions. That would spell danger." "Huh," Pagani said with a smile. "How can demigods be that free to pay notice to such small-scale arm deals? Every faction has a limited number of demigods. There are too many matters awaiting them." "I know. I'm only raising an example," Alfred replied in a staid manner. Pagani didn't harp on the matter and turned his gaze back to Dwayne Dantes, who stood outside the warehouse. "This gentleman is said to be very generous. He donated stocks worth more than £10,000 to the Church of Evernight shortly after he arrived in Backlund. Is this the early-stage investments that you often speak of? Also, he seems to be working at the same charity foundation with your sister. TSK, such men are very welcome with the young ladies. He's good-looking and has an outstanding demeanor. He's smart, experienced, and has the artifice. He has seen all kinds of women, and he's at the age to settle down. Alfred, you have to warn Audrey that a playboy will always be one and that one's moral character is a flaw that can never be corrected. You can't let the most dazzling jewel of Backlund be taken by this fellow." Alfred turned his head to glare at Pagani. "There's no need for you to show any concern about such matters. Audrey isn't a young and clueless lady. Her knowledge of the world is far more mature than you imagine. Besides, my father and mother are in Backlund. They have the ability to prevent any nasty things from happening." Upon saying that, Alfred looked at the nearby arms warehouse and paused. "Sanchez actually sent haggis. I'll go greet him. This isn't the best time to meet, right?" Just as Pagani was about to say a word, Alfred had already turned to walk down the stairs. Klein, in the form of Dwayne Dantes, didn't bring any servants. He held his golden-laid cane and stood with Sanchez's representative, Haggis, outside the warehouse. They watched as crates of munitions were carried out and loaded onto carriages. At this moment, he half-turned his body upon sensing something and looked elsewhere. The person that was reflected in his eyes was a young man wearing a trench coat without a hat. His blonde hair was combed into a slick back, and his blue eyes looked like a lake under a bright clear sky. He was tall with a good build. His every move exuded an indescribable sense of dignity. Even without any troops surrounding him, the authority he wielded was obvious. "Alfred." Haggis noticed the man as well when he cried out in delighted surprise. "Alfred. Miss Justice's second elder brother. This feeling resembles that of the arbiter pathway." Klein raised his right hand and took off his top hat to press it against his chest as a form of greeting. After Alfred Hall greeted Haggis, he turned to look at Dwayne Dantes. "Your character is widely spread across Backlund. Even I've heard of you, despite being in East Balham." "Character? A character at making arms deals?" Klein lampooned as he chuckled. "I'm only doing things that I believe need to be done." Alfred nodded. I believe there's no need for any self-introductions. Haggis should have mentioned me to you. Yes, Colonel Hall, Klein replied with a smile. I only learned that Miss Audrey has another brother here in the southern continent after I arrived, that he served in the military and has rendered impressive services. Alfred cast his gaze on Dwayne Dantes' face and changed the topic. I thought you would take the opportunity to work at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation, but you surprised me by choosing to come to the southern continent. Klein maintained his smile from before. For an outsider to truly enter a pre-existing circle is quite impossible just by giving donations, doing charity, and hosting balls and banquets. Alfred tersely answered, very wise. After exchanging a few pleasantries, he asked Haggis, did something happen in Kukua? It seemed rather serious. Haggis squeezed a smile. I'm not too sure. I was hiding in an underground bunker at the general's residence. I later heard that there was a lightning storm at Revival Square. Lightning storm? Alfred's gaze turned towards Dwayne Dantes again. Klein nodded and said, indeed. The hotel I was staying at isn't too far from Revival Square. I did see continuous bolts of lightning striking that area. All of that happened in the day. Alfred's gaze turned towards Haggis again. What happened to the scene in the end? Most of the area was in shambles. There were marks of lightning strikes. Haggis didn't hide the truth at all. Alfred nodded gently and pointed to the side before saying to Haggis and Dwayne Dantes, I still have other matters to tend to. We can chat again when the opportunity arises. See you again, Klein politely replied. It made them appear to be at a social gathering instead of being outside a munitions warehouse. He was watching Alfred Hall leave when his body trembled. His head made an abrupt turn to the side. In the primitive forests that covered East and West Balam, a figure was slowly outlined with his back bent. He had a fleshy face with slightly brown skin. His clothes were baggy, and he had a rapier by his waist. In his hand was a silver mask. Looking to his sides, this figure straightened his body. He was none other than Admiral Hell Ludwell, who had previously entered the underworld. However, at this moment, 2 clumps of blood-red flames were burning in his eye sockets. He looked completely different from before. I'm starving, Ludwell opened his mouth, letting out a sigh that seemed to come from his chest. He then cast his gaze in a different direction, muttering, the owner of this marionette is over there. Fate has brought us together again. He has a hunter pathway item on him. It's perfect for replenishing myself. Just as he said that, a bloody mouth appeared on the left cheek of Ludwell's face. It opened and closed as it said, Medici, what we need to deal with first is our survival. After this marionette loses its connection to its owner, it's no different from the dead. The remnant spirit will quickly return to the underworld and not be able to maintain the body. And without the underworld inside him, we will inevitably be weakened until we dissipate. Yes, the most pressing matter now is to find another gatekeeper. Another mouth appeared on Ludwell's right cheek. Red Angel Medici immediately scoffed. Sauron, Einhorn, were the 2 of you women in the past? Your nature as angels has been left in the dumps because of you. That fellow was able to resist 0-08's arrangement several times, implying that he's definitely not simple. With a chance to lock onto him, how can we give it up? Once this marionette completely dies, things wouldn't be that simple again. Besides, the hunter pathway item on him can effectively extend our existence. Once we finish him, it wouldn't be too late finding a gatekeeper. The bloody crack on Ludwell's left cheek immediately scoffed. Medici, have you sacrificed your brain to the true creator? That fellow has clearly advanced. In our current condition, defeating a bizarro sorcerer isn't difficult, but killing him is nearly impossible. Medici wasn't frustrated, and instead, he laughed deeply. This isn't something unresolvable. As long as you allow me to chant my lord's honorific name, helpers will immediately arrive. A gatekeeper might even be automatically brought here. The mouth on Ludwell's right cheek immediately opened and closed. Sauron, let's work together to stop him and search for a gatekeeper. All right. The mouth on Ludwell's left cheek didn't hesitate to reply. Upon seeing this, Red Angel Medici laughed. The two of you have fallen for it. My goal has been met. I can confirm that the two of you were previously women. The two mouths on Ludwell's cheeks roared, shut up. Humph, we've been merged together for 2,000 years. Would we not know what tricks you're up to? There's no need to struggle again. As they spoke, the colors around Admiral Hell Ludwell instantly saturated and stacked upon one another. He had entered the spirit world and began traversing it. Outside the munitions warehouse, Klein finally retracted his gaze as his premonition for danger vanished. For that one moment, he had a baffling feeling, but he was unable to project the corresponding scene in his mind. What happened? Klein muttered to himself. Without waiting any further, he threw the suitcase in his hand to the officer who was in charge of handing and taking over. Then, he said to Haggis, the rest is yours. You can give me the rest of the payment. He was referring to the heavy case filled with gold bars and coins. Haggis had planned on having drinks with Dwayne Dantes after the completion of the deal to celebrate its success, and to discuss any future deals. He never expected Dwayne Dantes to be in such a hurry to leave. All right. It's on the carriage, he pointed and said. Alfred, who had already walked quite a distance, turned his head to look over, perplexed. He wasn't sure why Dwayne Dantes wasn't following the pre-designated procedure. Chapter 966 Train. Seeing Alfred look over, Klein returned with a smile and nodded gently. I suddenly sensed some danger. With that said, he calmly turned around and headed for the carriage which Haggis had pointed out. Danger, Alfred repeated the word softly as he warily surveyed his surroundings but failed to find anything odd. He slowed down his pace, constantly taking note of his surroundings before returning to the nearby three-story building with out-of-the-ordinary vigilance. Pagani glanced at the heavy expression wearing Alfred and asked, feeling somewhat puzzled, what happened? He was quite a distance from the arms deal, so he hadn't heard their conversation. Alfred walked to the window and looked down at the convoy that was prepared to leave after loading the munitions. He deliberated and said, Dwayne Dantes suddenly left, saying that he had sensed danger. Danger? Pagani didn't dismiss it as he warily looked around. He didn't notice anything amiss even when Maysanchez's men left the region and vanished into the darkness. He then laughed. Alfred, I think you're too sensitive. I believe it's solely because Dwayne Dantes is a coward and was unwilling to stay here for too long. Alfred retracted his gaze and frowned. Perhaps. After returning to his hotel, Klein made Enzo, who had turned into a mixed-blood lad, open the suitcase in his hand. He took out the gold coins and bars one by one and did the count. It was valued at a total of 30,000 lone gold pounds. Thankfully my previous agreement with Miss Messenger is 10,000 lone gold coins. I don't need to make any additional conversions. Sitting leisurely in the reclining chair, Klein drank the sweet and sour but refreshing water as he monitored his marionette's work. After Enzo separated the items, he took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Rionette Tynker walked out of the void with the four blonde, red-eyed heads in hand. It was as though she was constantly nearby. Her 8 eyes turned towards the pile of gold coins and gold bars that had been separated. After a few seconds, the 4 heads in Rionette Tynker's hand said, very good, in the future, missions will cost more. What's the logic behind this? Why are you raising the price after the mission despite me paying you so quickly? Klein was taken aback as he asked with a straightened back, what? Rionette Tynker's 4 blonde, red-eyed heads nodded seriously. Mission, price, depends on your ability to earn money. I never expected that. Klein turned agape, but he was unable to retort. After all, such matters were solely decided by the helper. Furthermore, with him advancing to sequence 4 and becoming a demigod, the missions that he needed her help with in the future was likely to increase in difficulty and danger. It was seemingly reasonable to increase the price. After Rionette Tynker swallowed the gold coins and vanished from the room, Klein reined in his thoughts and began doing calculations regarding his current wealth. My expenses have been quite significant recently. I'm left with £17,275 in cash and 65 gold coins. This pile of gold bars is worth £25,000. That makes for a total of more than £40,000. It's not something to dismiss in all of the Lone Kingdom. I can already buy a manor and some land for farming. Arms dealing sure is profitable. Rionette Tynker needed gold coins, so whatever was left were gold bars. Standing up and sending the gold bars above the grey fog, Klein walked to the window and cast his gaze to the north. With the matter coming to a close, he was poised to return to Backlund. Looking at the horizon, Klein suddenly sighed silently. Backlund. Northborough, Backlund University of Technology. Audrey was touring the campus with a few staff members of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. She was dressed in a simple, light green dress. By her waist was a white, unadorned leather belt. Her blonde hair had a veiled hat with ribboned flowers that showed off her playful side. She didn't wear any other accessories other than a silver bangle on her left wrist. She looked no different from a female student that came from a family that could only be considered middle class. Over the past few days, she had been to public primary schools that bordered East Borough, and she had visited the technical schools in the area around Backlund Bridge. She already knew the appropriate clothes needed for the occasion, not treating charity work as another social scene. Her green, limpid eyes darted around slightly as she wore a faint smile as she observed the students that came and went. Backlund University of Technology had recently sent out its acceptance letters, and it was matriculation day for the new class of students. Matriculation should have happened in late August or early September, but as a newly restructured university, Backlund University of Technology's entrance examinations were later than the other universities. That also delayed the results, which also meant that students that applied to the school had also participated in the examinations of other universities or might have already been accepted. Therefore, they had brought forward the registration work to confirm the matriculated numbers before deciding how many more students needed to be accepted. Due to this, Audrey and the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation staff came to help the first batch of approved applicants to complete their matriculation procedure. Wherever she could see, she discovered that the students on campus wore a beaming expression, and every action they made exuded obvious confidence. Their words and actions had an indescribable vigor, one that seemed to have immense hope for the future that allowed them to see light. And this feeling was completely different from the few public primary schools that Audrey had experienced in the past. The students there were either boorish and noisy or silent and gloomy. A common trait of theirs was being uneasy and confused. Whenever they encountered strangers of status, they would be filled with trepidation. Their eyes were dull, lacking the spirit that youths ought to have. I really wish those kids will have a chance of receiving higher education and be like the students here where they can work hard for a better future. As Audrey sighed silently, she swept her gaze to a male-female duo who were likely siblings. The elder brother had clearly stepped into society and started working. He wore a silk hat and wore a rather thin black formal suit. He appeared to be in his 30s and had the air resembling a civil servant. He had borrowed a rather old camera from somewhere and had placed it on a tripod. He gestured for his younger sister to move and adjust her pose as he searched for the best angle. The sister was about 17 or 18, and her black hair simply cascaded down. Her brown eyes had a look of exasperation, but she didn't say a word as she seriously listened to her brother's instructions. Such combinations were everywhere on campus. Some of them had parents and their child, while others were groups of friends. What a beautiful scene. Audrey looked away and continued proceeding forward. It was a square, and in the middle of it was a decommissioned steam locomotive. Its massive body was standing there proudly, adding industrial vibes to the Backlund University of Technology. Whoosh! The behemoth-like steam locomotive spewed out smoke as it hauled its long body into the platform before slowing down a stop. A mixed-blood, 7- or 8-year-old girl who looked like a doll, held her mother's hand as she waited in a long line. She asked her father, who was similarly mixed blood with Lone and Balam heritage, about Desi Bay. Amidst her shuffling, she saw a gentleman with white sideburns and a top hat holding a gold-inlaid cane. He had a servant with brown skin as he walked towards first class. The servant looked around curiously and said, "Sir, the recent situation is different from what I had imagined. I thought the people from Balam would lead tough and difficult lives, with squalid, chaotic, poor, and repressed surroundings. But there was none of them. We even drank water and smoked East Balam cigarettes. There were even some people who could afford bikes. As you know, although I have Balam blood in me, I was born in Backlund. I've never been to the southern continent. Of course, my Dudanese is still not too bad." The very noble middle-aged gentleman chuckled and waved his cane. "That's because we only went to the cities and regions that aren't too bad. The saddest people of Balam are in the villages, in the plantations. The rest take up residence around the factories, creating slums. We never had a chance to see them." As though sensing the girl's notice, the gentleman with his deep blue eyes and his servant looked over and gave a warm smile. The corners of their lips clearly curled up, revealing 8 teeth before they nodded gently, looked away, and continued on their way. Before long, the girl and her parents boarded the steam locomotive and found their seats. When the whistle sounded again, the girl saw a man with dark brown skin, soft facial features, and red lumps on his cheek walk over with his head bowed. His hand pressed on his hat as he quickly walked down the aisle and headed for the head of the train. The man knocked on the partition before quickly entering the operator's compartment and said to the train driver, "All the train attendants have been swapped with our men. The bridge ahead is where the sacrifice will be held." With a thick mustache, the train driver nodded and said, "May God be satisfied with the sacrificial items on this train. Let's hope we can gain eternal life in the kingdom." Whoosh! The steam locomotive drove under a bridge before cruising past a huge bridge. After a long trip, it finally arrived at its destination, the pier. The doll-like, mixed-blood girl was somewhat sleepy and was no longer as lively as before. Under her parents' lead, she followed the crowd and inched towards the door. There were a few attendants at the door who were helping some of the passengers remove their luggage. When the girl and her parents walked past, these attendants curled the corners of their lips and revealed 8 teeth, showcasing a warm smile. After the girl jumped onto the platform, she looked back at them subconsciously. She saw figures standing outside the door, discussing something. Among them was the train conductor, as well as the man with the lumps on his cheek. A second later, these people turned their heads over and curled the corners of their lips, revealing 8 teeth. The girl retracted her gaze and skipped along as she left the platform with her parents. Chapter 967, Revelation. Cold winds blew across the platform at night, causing the hanging gas lamps to sway. The light of dusk stretched and shortened from time to time in this scene, allowing the steam locomotive that was silently parked on the tracks to oscillate between being cloaked in shadows or escaping the darkness. It had an indescribable sense of gloom and death. At this moment, a squad of black and white checkered policemen entered the platform. Under the lead of the railway company's duty manager, they walked to the huge train that appeared old. For some reason, after the passengers disembarked, all the train staff, including the train driver, returned to the carriage and never came out again. I sent people to look for them and get them out to have some rest, but they quickly ran out looking like that had been inflicted with a disease. All they could do was hysterically shout, "They're all dead, they're all dead." The railway duty manager in a blue coat held a lamp, walking as he briefed the police about the situation. From his stammering and trembling body, the police could easily tell the extreme horror in him. It was as though a sudden tap on his shoulder would literally cause him to jump and abandon everything to rush for the exit. His emotions infected the police. All of them held their hands to their waists as they pressed onto their holsters. Tap. 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 The leather shoes hitting the solid, hard ground left reverberating echoes. The police followed the duty manager and warily entered the front carriage. Inside the carriage, there were 2 people sitting in each row. They were distributed to the left and right, and they stood away from the windows. At that moment, they were leaning against the backs of their seats, motionless. Through the illumination of the gas lamps outside and lanterns in their hands, the inspectors leading them very quickly recognized the scene before him. Here were the staff of the steam locomotive. They were wearing blue uniforms that differed for men and women, and they were sitting in different seats in silence. Their faces were pale and their eyes wide open. Although there wasn't any sounds of breathing, the corners of their lips were curved up, revealing 8 teeth. Everyone present felt their hair stand up upon seeing the uniform smiles as they subconsciously held their breaths. This was an extremely bizarre and terrifying scene. All they wished was to turn around and leave, beginning investigations only when it was bright. The leading inspector drew 2 deep gasps before he instructed the constables beside him, "Go confirm if they are dead." Upon saying that, he glanced at the duty manager. "Follow him and see if there's anyone missing or excess people included." All right, officer," the duty manager said with a trembling voice. As he and the constables ventured deeper into the carriage, the other policemen drew their revolvers and remained on high alert. In an unbearable silence, time slowly ticked by until, finally, one of the constables stopped at the end of the carriage, turned around, and shouted, "It's confirmed. All of them are dead." The railway manager stuttered immediately after him, "There are 2 missing." The train driver and the train conductor. The inspector calmed down significantly when he realized that nothing had happened all this time. He thought and said to all the constables, "Maintain the corpse's present state and await an autopsy." Meanwhile, split into 2 teams. One team is to head to the other carriages to search for the train conductor and driver, while the other team is to check the scene for clues and relevant information. Once the sun rises, we will begin investigations starting with the train personnel and the passengers who were previously on board. We will search for any commonalities and peculiarities. Although many passengers didn't present their identification documents when purchasing tickets, the inspector believed that it was possible to find people who had registered themselves and learn from them of any abnormalities on the train or passengers worth paying attention to. Just as he said that, a biting cold wind stirred, blowing through the carriage. When all of this came to an end, the inspector was about to emphasize his orders when he suddenly noticed something amiss. The steam locomotive staff members who were in their seats still had their eyes open with their whites showing and their faces pale. However, their mouths had closed at some point in time and were no longer showing their 8 teeth. Inside a luxurious hotel room, the wall lamps shone brightly onto the carpeted region where a desk stood. Klein had transformed into German Sparrow and was sitting on a single-seater. He had his left leg crossed over his right. Beside him was Enzo, who looked like a native. In front of him stood a row of cultist marionettes. They were the people involved in attempting to make a sacrifice on the steam locomotive, the man with the lumpy cheek, the train conductor and the train driver. They had circled from different streets donning different looks to gather here. "Who made you do the sacrifice?" Klein asked in a deep voice. After advancing to sequence 4 and becoming a bizarro sorcerer, not only was he able to read the thoughts of his marionette's superficial consciousness, he could also use the increased control of spirit-body threads to do things similar to spirit channeling. Of course, the higher the level of the marionette, the poorer the effects of the spirit channeling. After a brief silence, the conductor, who was clearly lone with rather thick body hair, said blankly, "It's a revelation from God." "Which God?" Klein received the porcelain teacup from Enzo and took a sip. The train conductor replied in a daze, "God is God. There are no others." Klein lowered his cup and asked, "How did he reveal his revelation? What was said exactly?" The conductor instantly turned reverent. "He gave a revelation through a divine item, requesting us to sacrifice many lives to pleasure him. In return, he will give us eternal life in his kingdom." Sacrifice many lives. Compared to the numinous episcopate, the Rose school of thought prefers doing such things. They have always been infamous for blood sacrifices. But to have eternal life in God's kingdom is closer to the numinous episcopate's beliefs. Of course, I can't eliminate the possibility that it was fabricated. Klein pondered for a moment and asked, "What divine item?" The train driver didn't reply as he glanced at the man with the red, lumpy cheek. The man then took out an item from an inner pocket. It was a cloth doll of shabby craftsmanship with curved eyes and mouth. "God will issue us commands at a specific time through it. I bought it at a flea market," the man with the lumpy cheek said slowly without any perturbation in his tone. "This." Klein instantly thought of many possibilities before getting Enzo to take the cloth doll and scrutinize it carefully, but he didn't discover anything odd. With his experience, this meant that the problem wasn't with the doll. That meant that there were two possibilities. First, someone was using the doll as a decoy while acting as a deity nearby. Second, it was a truly secret existence who had specially labeled the item to send a revelation. If it's the former, the train attendant's death would have been discovered, and preparations would have been made. If it's the latter, perhaps nothing has been detected. Klein contemplated for a moment and made Enzo place the cloth door on the desk in front of the window. He then stood up and instantly transformed into another train attendant and stood with the row of cultists. Similar changes happened when Enzo returned. After an unknown period of time, the night grew deeper. Suddenly, on the desk bathed in crimson moonlight, the cloth doll with curved eyes and mouth moved its limbs and slowly stood up. Chapter 968 Descending, Saint. The cloth doll turned its lifeless eyes before its body stood up straight. It looked towards the area that the crimson moonlight failed to illuminate. There, the man with the lumpy cheek and the other cultists had been standing quietly, but at this moment, they bowed their heads, raising their arms as though they were praying, piously listening to the revelation. About 2 to 3 seconds later, the cloth doll finally stood up straight. Just as it was about to open its tongueless mouth and produce a voice that didn't belong to the body it was in, all its movements suddenly turned sluggish, as though it was a highly rusted robot. Hidden amongst the cultists, Klein had seen a strange spirituality thread extend from the cloth doll. Without any hesitation, he began controlling it. Inside the wall lamp-illuminated room, the lights dimmed instantly. The doll with curved eyes and mouth instantly lost the support that seemed to arise from having a skeleton before slumping to the table, motionless. Amidst the flickering street lights that were more than 1,000 meters away, Klein lost control over the blob of spirit-body threads. The power that descended with the help of the doll took less than 2 seconds to escape out of his range. Whoosh! A biting cold wind swept up inside the room as the rug with tables and chairs above was suddenly tugged, sending the man with the lumpy cheek and most of the other cultists tumbling. Only the disguised Klein had jumped up in time to avoid the accident. Of course, Winner Enzo stood perfectly fine at the border of the rug, completely unaffected. Whoosh! Amidst the cold wind, the rug rolled up and bound the few cultists and covered their noses and mouth tightly, gripping their throats. Meanwhile, the fountain pens on the table had their caps removed autonomously before shooting forward, stabbing into the neck of the man with the lumpy cheek. They left no gaps in the dense array of pens. A wooden chair exploded as its splinters swept over without sparing any of the remaining cultists. Near the wall, the pipe of a wall lamp cracked, causing the gas inside to whistle out. The cloth that draped the sofa rose up, tied itself into a robe, and wrapped around the train conductor's throat. A few of the floor tiles flew up, stabbing a few cultists from below. Instantly, all the items in the room were filled with offensive capability as though they were attempting to kill all signs of life inside. Klein tried to dodge, but his shirt, pants, belt, coat, and hat seemed to have a life of their own. They forcefully locked him down on the spot. He hurriedly opened his mouth and let out a sound, "Pa." He had mimicked the sound of snapping fingers. Scarlet flames surged out from his clothes, instantly blanketing his body and removing the restraints. At this moment, the cloth on another sofa rose up as though it was draped over someone. This strange scene reflected in Klein's eyes immediately as he trembled and turned stiff. He had been possessed by an evil spirit. The flames that soared up from before hadn't extinguished. They were burning away his clothes and flesh, only to reduce him to a pitch-black paper figurine. Behind this paper figurine was a pattern covered with feathers. It was a surreal and illusory feeling. This was the mutated paper figurine that had been tainted with artificial death's aura. Klein knew that there were only two situations that were possible for the doll to mutate. One was that the entity disguising as a god was nearby and had sensed the deaths of the cultists, hence, preparations were made via a deliberate descent, laying a trap for the antagonist. Another was that the one using the doll was indeed some secret existence. He wasn't aware that the sacrificial ritual had been foiled and descended at the predetermined time to give the next round of revelations. And regardless of which situation it was, it meant danger. Therefore, how could Klein perform unprepared? Based on the characteristics of a descent or the possession of the doll, he had already placed the paper figurine, which had mutated because of the corruption of artificial death's aura, in the iron cigar case. He had also maintained the level of his marionette at the level of an ordinary person in order to lure the target into possessing him. At this point, the possession target of the god that the cultists worshipped had gone from Klein to the death paper figurine. As the scarlet flames swept about, the pitch-black paper figurine ignited as a pale white color spread abruptly, tinged with a slightly dark green color. A rather painful grunt sounded as a transparent afterimage flashed across a window tinted with the crimson moonlight. Almost at the same instant, the items that came alive inside the room fell to the ground, returning to their lifeless state. As for Enzo, flames were swirling around him. At this moment, in the port city north of the southern continent, the residents were enjoying the comfort and warmth of their home and family at night. They didn't notice that their glass windows and the surfaces of the wall lamps would dim before quickly returning to normal. Alongside this dimming environment, the flames in the fireplace either intensified or dwindled. The remnants in the kitchen were ignited and snuffed out. During this process, the glass windows in that room dimmed the most, and the fluctuations in the flames kept happening. However, the believers in the room were praying to the primordial moon, paying no notice to what was happening. After an unknown period of time, the crimson moonlight brightened a little, as though covering the entire city in a light veil. Such brightness quickly returned to normal as a scarlet-red flame flared up on a silver candle on a dining table. Enzo walked out of it as his body and face rapidly changed into Gehrman Sparrow. Just moments ago, at the instant when the crimson moon brightened, he had lost his target. Not only possessing the Beyonder powers of a high-sequence Beyonder of the Wraith pathway, but they can also borrow the power of the Crimson Moon. Regarding these two aspects, one of them is only possible with a sealed artifact or mystical item. Klein muttered silently and came to a preliminary judgment. After the demigod who possessed the doll had been corrupted by the death paper figurine, he had believed that he had the chance to take his opponent down. To his surprise, the enemy's strength and means available to them were more varied and potent than he imagined. The only thing he could confirm was that it wasn't an angel, as the strength and level were far inferior to one. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Klein left the dining room and entered the activity room. There were a few believers praying to the primordial moon. Unlike the cultists on the steam locomotive, they knew who they were praying to, as though they were more formal members of the parish. 1 step. 2 steps. 3 steps. Klein entered the room in an unhurried pace before they turned their heads when they noticed him. With the powerful illusion power of a bizarro sorcerer, they treated Gehrman Sparrow as an oracle that had descended upon them. They saw a bright moon halo at his head. The believers plopped to their knees in devout prostration. Klein didn't beat about the bush as he asked in a deep voice, "Who was the saint you met previously?" Although one of the believers was puzzled, he still respectfully answered, "Oracle, it was Shaman King Klarman." Shaman King Klarman. That's a familiar name. Ah, right, the author of that book of secrets. Isn't he long dead? He was alive in a time over a millennium ago. Saints of non-special pathways have no way of living that long. He joined the Rose school of thought but still believes in the primordial moon. Through some means, he has extended his life? Or could it be that his sequence alone affords him a long life? Klein's mind whirred and recalled the origins of the name, Klarman. A sailboat was docked by the pier as the faint moonlight illuminated the cabin's interior. A figure with frizzled black hair with white streaks in them walked out of a mirror. He wore a back robe with crimson patterns. He had wrinkles that were neither too deep or shallow on his face. His eyes were bloodshot. At this moment, on the skin he exposed, such as the back of his hand, his pores had expanded, producing white feathers that were stained with pale yellow oil. This elder's expression was somewhat warped as if he was enduring pain. He quickly sat on the bedside, bowed his head, clasped his hands, and silently chanted. In his jarring voice, his forehead slowly cracked apart, revealing a red full moon that seemed to be embedded in it. The moonlight dispersed and cloaked the elder, causing the white feathers on him to contract and recede into nothingness. But at this moment, his abdomen bloated up as though it was filled with liquid. Finally, his clothes, together with his skin, tore apart as a blob of flesh and blood covered in white feathers flew out onto the deck. After squirming for quite a while, it rotted and died. Phew! The elder looked up and slowly exhaled. His bloodshot eyes were filled with puzzlement. He muttered softly, "Death's blessed." But death is no more. Early in the morning, the Church of Storms mandated punishers, who had taken over the case of the mysterious deaths of the steam locomotive staff, had received new intelligence. The missing conductor and driver, as well as a few suspicious passengers, had been found. Before long, this mandated punisher team followed the clues and found their targets. They were silently hung outside a building in a row. "This is a provocation." The mandated punisher's captain growled through clenched teeth. But after they lowered the corpses and carried out their investigations inside the room, they saw that these people had been piously praying to the primordial moon in the activity room, holding a rather diabolical ritual. "Apprehend all of them." The mandated punisher captain issued a command after a second of surprise. The believers of the primordial moon seemed to regain their reason as they tried to resist. However, they were quickly suppressed, either dying or being injured in the process. The mandated punisher captain surveyed the area and inexplicably said to his peers, "They didn't notice the row of corpses hanging at their doorstep?" A member of the reader pathway thought and said, "Those corpses might have been left there to guide us to investigate the area." The mandated punisher captain calmed himself down and nodded in thought. Which church's demigod passed by? Chapter 969 Duke Backlund, Westborough, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White, who had been summoned, took off his hat and coat and entered the activity room to wait. In this room, there were a few other sanguine members who had been called by name to meet the important figure. After surveying the area, Emlyn picked a spot to sit in, right beside a man with a nose so high that it almost seemed deformed. Adorning his cut face was brown hair and red eyes. He held a comic in his hand, reading through it aimlessly. He was none other than the Sanguine who had provided Emlyn with the information about the ancient, abandoned castle in Delaire Forest. His name was Ernst Boyar, a viscount. Emlyn had planned on visiting this viscount in the next couple of days, but he never expected to bump into him here. After some careful consideration, he said in deliberation, "Your lordship, I would like to know where you obtained the intel regarding the ancient abandoned castle in Delaire Forest." "Why? Did your client say that there weren't any ancient wraiths?" Ernst Boyar moved his gaze away from his comic and shot Emlyn a glance. "No, not at all." Emlyn didn't provide an explanation as he stubbornly emphasized his question again. "I'm just very curious of the source. It doesn't seem that simple." Ernst Boyar closed his comic and nodded slightly. "It's not a secret. I learned of it from Lord Nibs. To be frank, I've never heard of this before. I find it hard to imagine that there's such an ancient castle in Delaire Forest." Lord Nibs. Emlyn instinctively had some thoughts arise in him. It's another test. But isn't such a test too dangerous? It even needed Mr. Fool to resolve it. Emlyn frowned slightly as he recalled the details he had contemplated previously. He probed, "Your lordship, then why didn't you explore that ancient castle? I remember you being an archaeologist. And during this process, you'll be able to obtain the corresponding beyonder ingredients of an ancient wraith. Lord Nibs told me that it's very dangerous. One shouldn't approach it unless they're at the level of Earl." Emlyn's mouth gaped as his expression fell into a daze. He then held back his anger and asked with a suppressed voice, "Then why didn't you warn me?" Ernst laughed. "Isn't it obvious? How can a location with beyonder creatures present, one that's known by us Sanguine, still exist if not for special reasons?" Emlyn fell into a daze as Ernst added, "Normal reasoning should be like this: ancient wraiths might exist in some place in Delaire Forest. People have encountered it before, but they were unable to find their origins. This means that finding those ancient wraiths is a very difficult and troublesome affair. The time cost exceeds their value, which allows them to live to this day. I thought you'd have easily discovered the problem with this reasoning. Likewise for your client. If they had chosen to take action, they must have had possessed the corresponding confidence." At that instant, Emlyn felt that Viscount Ernst made plenty of sense, and he could hardly rebut him. He believed that it was because he and Miss Magician were too foolish, resulting in her slamming headfirst into danger. It had nothing to do with him. The next instant, Emlyn felt embarrassed and frustrated, filled with anger towards himself. Finally, Emlyn figured out another problem: regardless of whether the intel exposes any danger or not, Ernst Boyar should have clearly informed me of this point, because figuring out the level of danger, the source of danger, and how the danger manifested itself, it held immense importance in the subsequent exploration, one that can't be missed. He did it on purpose. Emlyn came to a final conclusion as his scarlet eyes narrowed. He raised his chin and said, "Indeed. It's easy to tell, but I'm more curious about the danger lurking in that ancient abandoned castle." Ernst picked up the black tea that nearly resembled the color of blood and sipped it. "I'm not sure either. Lord Nibs didn't mention anything." Emlyn's expression sank. Just as he was about to make a derisive remark, he suddenly saw Odora Cosme walk into the activity room and look at him. "Emlyn, it's time for the meeting." "All right." Emlyn reined in his emotions and pressed onto the bottom half of his vest, standing up unhurriedly. Following him down the stairs underground, he finally couldn't help but softly ask, "Baron Cosme, who am I actually meeting? How should I address him?" Cosme, who looked like a middle-aged gentleman, didn't hide the truth. He replied with deep respect, "Duke Olmer." "Duke Olmer." Emlyn subconsciously straightened his back and cast his gaze to the lamps on the wall. He appeared to use the reflection of the metal surface to check on his appearance. He was one of the three dukes that held up the Sanguine, an ancient powerhouse who existed before the cataclysm. His title was Round Moon, with an age exceeding 3,000 years. He had once followed in the footsteps of ancestor Lilith. Without a doubt, this was synonymous with the history and glory of the Sanguine. After passing several secret doors, Emlyn and Cosme arrived inside a metal-grey hall. The ground and walls were filled with green grass, flowers, and grain. Insects were crawling between the plants, making Emlyn feel as though he had left the city and arrived somewhere rural. He felt life thriving all around him. Such a scene didn't seem too odd, but on careful inspection, there were many strange points. The grass had mouth-like crevices with fibers flying out of them to capture the insects. The flowers used their leaves as hands to harvest pollen for themselves. The grains were heavy, occasionally emitting wailing from inside. There was a myriad spectrum of extraordinary insects. Some had snakes for heads, others birds. These things grew lusher the closer it was to the middle of the hall. Surrounding the area was a grave filled with exuberant spirits. Cosme faced the grave and reverently bowed. "Your Grace, Emlyn White is here." "Good afternoon, Your Grace." Emlyn didn't don his usual arrogance and was, in fact, a little flustered. Inside the grave, a mellow voice which didn't betray its owner's age chuckled. "A very outstanding young Sanguine. Cosme, you may leave for now." "Yes, Your Grace." Cosme bowed in response and left the metal-grey hall that was filled with freshness. Emlyn stood there, listening to the mellow voice from the grave. "In the morning, Nibs informed me that you obtained the artificial vampire Beyonder characteristic that corresponds to the Viscount title?" "Yes, but it has been corrupted and requires purification." Emlyn hadn't mentioned the need to remove the mental corruption in the Beyonder characteristics, because he believed that it was a trivial matter to the Sanguine. At the very least, Baron Cosme had previously confirmed that it was possible. Ulmer tersely acknowledged. "Very well. I'll personally purify that characteristic." He paused before saying, "Although the Sanguine enjoy a long life, we will still mature and grow old. There will be new births and deaths. Regardless, nurturing young members is a necessity for any race. As for the excellent talent and outstanding abilities you have recently showcased, they have made you a target we place great importance on. Therefore, I personally came to meet you to give you some tests so as to expedite your growth." Excellent talent and outstanding abilities. Emlyn raised his chin slightly higher once again. He then sighed inwardly. Indeed, just as Mr. Hanged Man determined, there will be a test and mission, as well as an interview. Amidst his overflowing emotions, Emlyn replied reverently, "I'm always prepared." "Not bad," Ulmer's mellow voice sounded from the grave. "Your next mission is to find the key members of the Rose School of Thought that are hiding in Backland. There are very few clues for this, and many situations will require you to carry out the investigation by yourself." "Rose School of Thought? They have a grudge with us Sanguine? They seem to be taking in some believers of the primordial moon." Emlyn actually knew quite a bit about the Rose School of Thought via the Tarot Club, but he deliberately hid this without showcasing it. Apart from taking in believers of the primordial moon, they have in their possession one of the holy artifacts of us Sanguine. It was something left by the ancestor. We need to retrieve it. There was a solemnity in Ulmer's voice. Left by the ancestor. Holy artifact of the Sanguine. Emlyn didn't hesitate to say, "Your Grace, I'll work hard to find the key members of the Rose School of Thought in Backland." Ulmer's voice turned mellow. "Very good. Get some of the intel from Cosme in a while and seek out an incisive point." Emlyn was already eager to do so, but he still restrained himself, asking in deliberation, "Your Grace, do you know about the abandoned ancient castle in Delaire Forest? You wish to head there?" "It's very dangerous," Ulmer said from inside the grave. Emlyn didn't explain as he directly asked, "What kind of danger?" Ulmer chuckled. "That ancient castle might be older than me, even older than Delaire Forest. I do not know who built it. I only know that there's something sealed underground, and it hides an immense secret. Any creature that approaches it will be in danger of being corrupted by the force within. We once imagined that it has something to do with the abyss, but a devil suffered corruption after being thrown into the ancient castle as well, turning crazy and chaotic from his cold and cruel demeanor. Then why didn't you attempt to open the seal to figure out the situation? Emlyn mumbled inwardly but didn't say a word. Ulmer didn't speak further as he ended the conversation and dismissed Emlyn. In the evening, Backlund was covered with dark clouds as a drizzle began falling. Emlyn White wore a hat and walked under a sheltered veranda, his scarlet eyes locked onto Viscount Ernst Boyar, who was browsing some antique stores. He was upset that Ernst had given him incomplete intelligence, so he had subconsciously tailed him after leaving the Odora villa. But after a while, he felt lost. He hadn't figured out how to deal with Ernst or how severe a lesson he should teach him. Chapter 970 Talent at soliciting donations. After blankly following Ernst Boyar for a distance, Emlyn White gradually abandoned his thoughts. He glanced at the area beyond the veranda as the downpour grew in intensity. He couldn't help but think, how should I punish Ernst? Although he had done so because he likely followed orders or a cue, it's still despicable. As for Lord Nibs, I presently do not have the ability. But wait, once I become a marquis or a duke, I'll definitely make him pay the price. Miss Magician has already completed her exploration of the ancient abandoned castle. I'm not sure if Lord Nibs had sent Sanguine to monitor the area. From her tone, description, and the feedback given by Mr. Fool, there was probably no monitors. Could it be that Lord Nibs didn't send any Sanguine to the vicinity of the ancient castle? But what's the point of such a test? Or could it be that they missed it because of some problems? Amidst his thoughts, Emlyn White felt that he needed to get someone to discuss the matter of punishing Ernst Boyar. He was severely lacking in such experience. Subconsciously, the first candidate of choice that came to him was the Hanged Man. This senior member of the Tarot Club was shown to be extremely experienced in various matters. He was extraordinarily reliable and had never left the other members disappointed. After hesitating for a few seconds, Emlyn struck down this choice. This was because this matter involved the Sanguine's internal test. To consult the Tarot Club members before he obtained an answer damaged his pride and overall image of the Sanguine. By the same reason, he eliminated the world as a choice. Of course, he believed he could guess the suggestion that the world would give, kill him. There's no need to go that far. Emlyn mumbled inwardly. As he aimlessly tailed Ernst Boyar, he began expanding the candidates to the real world. Then, he realized he didn't have anyone to choose from. He almost had 0 friends. Eliminating his parents who were Sanguine as well, he only had 2 or 3 people in mind. They were the Harvest Church's Father Yatravsky and Detective Sherlock Moriarty, who had a mysterious background and a myriad of means at his disposal. Sherlock hasn't returned after leaving Backlund. Sigh, I can only seek out Father Yatravsky tomorrow. But I can't be that direct. Emlyn quickly made up his mind. He walked past Ernst Boyar, who entered a watch shop, and headed for the end of the veranda where there were several rental carriages. Getting in the carriage, he felt the wheels turning. He casually glanced out the window and saw more raindrops striking the glass, drawing out trails that streaked down. In his blurred vision, carriages drove past. Audrey retracted her gaze from the rainy scene outside the carriage and glanced at her lady's maid, Annie, before communicating with Susie silently. The look in her eyes, her expression, and her not obvious body language said, "We're almost home." I'm a little nervous. On the ground, Susie shook her tail, raised her paw, and adjusted the gold-rimmed glasses hanging by her neck. Together with the changes in the colors of her ether body and body of heart and mind, she expressed herself, "Don't worry. That Ma'am Escalante, who's a psychiatrist on the surface, is only a telepathist. She won't be able to see through your lies. Audrey nodded gently and watched her carriage enter the Hall family's luxurious villa and stop in front of the sheltered foyer. Ever since joining the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation, she had begun spending less time at home. She had originally planned on meeting Ma'am Escalante from the Psychology Alchemists at 22 Phelps Street in Northborough, but since Mr. Dwayne Dantes had left for the southern continent and wasn't in the foundation, there was no need for that. In the study she called her own, Audrey met Ma'am Escalante Ocelica, who had black hair reaching her waist and a baby face. "I must apologize. I'd been busy meeting up with friends after returning to Backlund. My subsequent joining of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation has delayed my meeting with you until today." After leaving Susie outside, Audrey elegantly bowed to express her attitude. In fact, this has been deliberate. By dragging out their meeting for about a month, her digestion of the psychiatrist potion and advancement to hypnotist became rather reasonable. It was the progress one would expect from a genius and nothing else. Escalante returned the greeting without much thought. "I heard that you have been busy with children who desire knowledge. Your virtues are more dazzling than diamonds." As Audrey gestured for her to sit, she walked to a single-seater and tersely acknowledged. "Those children are in situations I've never seen before. There's often a voice inside me that's urging me to do something. Ma'am Escalante, if you're free, you can join me and the staff of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation to go visit the different schools. There, you will get to see what most children in the world are experiencing." Having said that, she chuckled as though being self-deprecatory. "I apologize. I've recently been accustomed to kickstart such topics. It's because I wish for more nobles and the wealthy to involve themselves in such charities. I hope they can donate more to help even more children." After hearing Audrey, Escalante replied somewhat uncomfortably, "I will do so. I'll also donate some money to the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation." "No, I'm not forcing you to donate. This has to be an action that comes from the heart, and something voluntary. I only wish for you to take a look and then inform the people around you of these children's plight and their possible futures. This includes the members of the Psychology Alchemists." Audrey shook her head, rejecting Escalante's suggestion. "All right." Escalante first nodded gently in agreement before feeling that there was something ridiculous in this matter. Miss Audrey's true motives were to solicit donations from the Psychology Alchemists. But this was a secret, extraordinary underground organization. This was no different from soliciting donations from the Aurora Order. Audrey didn't continue discussing matters related to the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Instead, she said, "Ma'am Escalante, I have something I'd like to inform you of." "What is it?" Escalante read the solemnity, joy, and pride from her actions and emotions. Audrey smiled and said, "I've already become a hypnotist." At that moment, Escalante suspected that Audrey had hypnotized her. Although she knew that Audrey had obtained the hypnotist potion formula previously, how long ago was that? "You should be able to determine that I'm not lying," Audrey said with a smile. Only then did Escalante snap to her senses as she asked in surprise and doubt, "You seem to have some extraordinary encounter?" "It's to have the courage to make use of matters." Audrey said things that couldn't be any truer. Escalante frowned and said with some hesitation, "You wish for the Sequence 5 potion formula?" "Yes." "What do I need to do, or what price needs to be paid?" Audrey didn't hide her motives. Escalante looked at the beautiful, blonde, and green-eyed lady in front of her and deliberated. "This isn't something that's up to me to decide. I will report it and try to arrange for you to meet with Hilbert and Stephen." She was referring to psychologist and jewelry designer, Hilbert Alucard, and furniture merchant, Stephen Hamprez. Clearly, in this group of Psychology Alchemists members, Escalante was in a subordinate position. Audrey wasn't surprised by Escalante's reaction, but this didn't mean that her handling of matters wasn't without a problem. A Sequence 6 Beyonder who had the wish to advance was someone that required deep importance to be attached to in any secret organization. This was even the case with the Orthodox churches. They were people who were qualified to meet high-ranking members directly. This also meant that, after advancing to hypnotist, Audrey was already an elite in the middle-ranking members of the psychology alchemists. Her next goal was to become a quasi-high-ranking member. The person she needed to meet was a counselor of the Psychology Alchemists' Council, and not Hilbert or Stephen. As her thoughts flashed across her mind, Audrey deliberately showed some of her displeasure. Escalante acutely noticed this and hurriedly explained, "Meeting Hilbert and Stephen is to confirm your condition before a counselor meets you. In fact, with your present level, you should be leading a team and recruiting new members. But with your identity, status, and daily environment, we have cancelled that plan, afraid that it would influence your normal day-to-day life." Counselor. I wonder how many counselors from the psychology alchemists there are in Backlund. Could it be the royal family's consultant, Vin Rambus? Audrey nodded in thought and said, "I can understand that and will await your arrangements." She then diverted the topic and asked with a curious look, "Ma'am Escalante, do you know what's the name of the sequence 5 potion of the spectator pathway?" Seeing this blonde, green-eyed, young noble lady taking on such a demure pose, Escalante silently heaved a sigh of relief. "I've once heard Hilbert mention that it's called Dreamwalker." Dreamwalker. This is somewhat different from what I imagined. Or it could be that dream is just an analogy. To be precise, it should be subconscious walker. Audrey didn't conceal her contemplation and analysis before directing her questions to psychology and various information. After having Escalante stay for dinner, she sent the lady to the door where she got on a carriage. At this moment, it was dark outside with gales roaring and rain pouring. Amidst the pouring rain, howling winds, and the dark night, a steam sailboat hybrid was cruising through the safe sea route in the Berserk Sea with tourists on board. Klein had already left the southern continent and had returned to Desi Bay as Dwayne Dantes. Amidst the shaking ship, he suddenly woke up, got out of bed, and headed to the window of his first-class cabin's living room to look outside. Amidst the downpour, 3 huge strange pure-black sailboats were silently cruising over. Hanging on their sides were lanterns with 3 black sails on masts almost 100 meters long. And on its deck stood a mottled stone chair that was 2 to 3 meters high, its back facing the cabin. No one was sitting on it. It was the Black Emperor symbol of the King of the 5 Seas, Nast. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.